Anime Autopsy here, and I need you to sit down because we need to have a conversation about Joy Boy's promise. You know that sentence we all repeat on autopilot, Joy Boy failed the Fishmen? Yeah, that one. I'm genuinely convinced our community has just collectively decided that's canon, stamped it, laminated it, and never actually checked what the story says. Every week I see the same thing. Someone on Twitter or Reddit posts that Fishman Island panel. Robin, the poneglyph, Neptune crying, Shirahoshi looking tragic. Caption: Joy Boy's promise to save the fishmen from discrimination. Peak foreshadowing. Oda is a genius, he planned this 20 years ago. And listen to me. I need you to actually zoom in on that stone. The wording on that apology does not say what you think it says. It does not say, "Dear Fishman, sorry I failed your entire race." Here's the thing. In the manga, Neptune explicitly tells Robin that the message is an apology addressed to Poseidon. Not to Fishman Island as a nation, not to all merfolk everywhere, but to Poseidon. That is a completely different category of promise. That's the author waving a giant red flag that this is about an ancient weapon, a specific role, a planned world-scale operation involving the Noah and the Sea Kings. And we have somehow boiled it down to, he promised to end racism. And this is not a sin. This is normal. Fans fill in gaps. We see Otohimi's dream of the surface, Fisher Tiger's trauma, Neptune's faith in a future promised day. And our pattern-seeking monkey brain goes, oh, obviously Joy Boy promised to relocate Fishman Island and failed. It feels clean. It feels emotionally satisfying. It just isn't what the text actually guarantees. I say this with zero superiority and a frankly embarrassing browser history. I have spent an absurd amount of my adult life rereading Fishman Island, pausing on every poneglyph panel, cross-checking SBS answers about ancient weapons, scrubbing through Sea King dialogue, trying to see where Oda ever writes Joy Boy's promise to the Fishmen. It's not there. The closest we get is characters on Fishman Island projecting their own suffering onto an 800-year-old apology that was never addressed to them in the first place. And that's the problem. By laundering that headcanon into truth, we have completely missed what Oda is actually foreshadowing. We've turned a global endgame setup into a local tragedy arc. We've treated Joy Boy as the failed social worker of Fishman Island, instead of the centerpiece of a pre-written plan involving Poseidon, the Noah, and the surface of the entire world. So here's my pitch for the next 2 hours. Joy Boy's promise was never to the Fishmen as a race. Not in the way you've been told. And I'm going to prove it, line by line, poneglyph by poneglyph, until that Twitter meme dies in your heart forever. What this video is actually doing, and why it's so long. So, yes, you read the timestamp correctly. This is a 2-hour Joy Boy video about a single apology, about one poneglyph that doesn't even have a cool drawing on it. I need you to understand why that is not me being a content gremlin, and is actually required by the scope of the problem. Here's the thing. The moment you say, Joy Boy's promise wasn't to the Fishmen, you are no longer just talking about Fishman Island. You are automatically talking about the Void Century, about Poseidon, about the ancient weapons as a system, about the Noah, about Luffy's Nika parallels, and about 15 years of fandom discourse that has turned one vague apology into a full-blown racial salvation prophecy. You cannot untangle that in 20 minutes and still be honest with the text. So, let me lay the thesis on the table in plain language. The promise, as written, is an apology to Poseidon that plugs into a global plan. That's the category it actually belongs to. The poneglyph does not say, "Dear Fishman, sorry I didn't lift you to the surface." Neptune literally calls it an apology to Poseidon, and the Noah is a world-scale mechanism moved by Sea Kings, not a glorified moving truck for one island. My claim is that Otohime, Fisher Tiger, Neptune, and the community of Fishman Island reinterpreted that older, world-facing promise through their trauma and turned it into a personal prophecy of deliverance. This is not a sin. This is what oppressed communities do with myths all the time. But if we're going to argue that, we need to be precise about method. So in this video, I'm building a little conceptual toolbox first: foreshadowing, retrofitting, and pre-writing. We're going to define those cleanly, and then I am going to march every Joy Boy clue, every Fishman Island speech, every Sea King mumble through that scanner. Is this thing intentional setup for a known payoff? Is it a retrofit where the author went back and assigned meaning later? Or is it a fragment from a pre-written endgame being revealed out of order? Because if we don't draw that line, every panel becomes foreshadowing. Every sad mermaid tear, every sun symbol, every shot of the Noah turns into proof for whatever headcanon you woke up with that morning. And once the word foreshadowing means any coincidence I can screenshot, it means nothing. Then you're just a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Joy Boy in toast. So listen to me. This is why it's long. We're going to read the actual poneglyph wording. We're going to sit with the Sea Kings spelling out that they're waiting for Poseidon and that person. We're going to cross-check Oda's interviews on ancient weapons. Look at how the arc is structured around Otterheim's dream versus the Noah's function, and ask, point by point, which pieces are planned setup and which are Fishman Island's retroactive myth-making. By the end, you should be able to look at any Joy Boy panel and know which category it belongs to. And once that framework is in place, then we can finally ask the real question. If Joy Boy's promise wasn't to the Fishmen, who was it actually for? And what does that do to Luffy's final job description? How fandom broke the word foreshadowing. So before we start sorting Joy Boy panels into neat little piles, we need to talk about a word this community has absolutely destroyed: foreshadowing. Because right now, everything is foreshadowing. A background silhouette? Foreshadowing. A throwaway gag line? Insane foreshadowing. A fish in a barrel in Chapter 3. Clearly a planned hint for Fishman Island, Joy Boy, the Ancient Kingdom, and your mom's maiden name. Listen to me. When every tiny coincidence and visual rhyme gets thrown into the same category, the word stops meaning anything. We can't tell the difference between an intentional setup and a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast and calls it Oda's 4D chess. Here's the thing, this is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal fandom behavior. You read a long-running story, you fall in love with it, your brain wants to connect dots. Of course you start screaming foreshadowing every time you see a crown, a sun, or a fish. But then you get takes where people seriously argue that every single fish-related visual in East Blue was foreshadowing Fishman Island. A random Sea King design? Foreshadowing. A restaurant called Barity that happens to serve seafood? Foreshadowing. Sanji smoking near a fish tank? Clearly a deliberate planned commentary on class oppression under the red line. No. Sometimes a fish is just a fish. Sometimes an author is drawing an ocean world, and shockingly, there are fish in it. The problem is that when we flatten everything into insane foreshadowing, we actually disrespect real craft. Foreshadowing in the technical sense is hard. It is specific. It is intentional. You decide on a payoff. You plant a setup. You carry that thread for years without contradicting yourself. That is a different category of writing from, oh, this old panel kind of fits our new theory now. When we treat a background fish and the Laboon Brook promise as the same kind of move, we erase the difference between planned storytelling and happy accident. We overcredit the author for noise, and weirdly, we undercredit them for the signals that actually took discipline to maintain. And if we can't tell those apart on small things, what happens when we hit something as loaded as Joy Boy's promise? We just shout foreshadowing louder than the next person. The poneglyph wording foreshadows this. No, the Sea Kings foreshadow that. At that point, we're not analyzing. We're volume testing our confidence. Pattern interrupt. What if I told you that a huge chunk of what you think is foreshadowing isn't wrong, it's just misfiled? I need you to sit with that, because to talk about Joy Boy intelligently, we need a stricter framework. We need to separate three things: genuine foreshadowing, where Oda knew the payoff; retrofitting, where he cleverly repurposes old material; and pre-writing, where the endgame exists first and the hints are just fragments of a decision already made. Once we have those 3 boxes, then we can finally open up Fishman Island, the apology to Poseidon, the Noah, the Sea Kings, and Joy Boy's so-called promise, and see which pieces were truly planned and which were the story catching up to itself. The 3 buckets: foreshadowing, retrofitting, and something else. So we need to actually build those 3 boxes, because if we don't, every Joy Boy panel, every Fishman Island speech just gets thrown into the same soup and the community starts seeing Jesus in toast again. Foreshadowing first. Classical, boring, textbook foreshadowing. Foreshadowing in the strict sense is when an author intentionally plants information early so a later payoff feels earned. The key word there is intentionally. The setup is not a coincidence you discovered after the fact. It's a decision the author already made, encoded in advance. You hang the gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1 because you know, with absolute clarity, someone is getting shot in Act 3. That's the gold standard. That's the thing fans want everything to be. And when it's done well, it feels almost unfair. Laboon and Brooke, Sanji's North Blue, that's odd detail paying off with Germa. Those are clean, documented, I planned this moments. Intent is the non-negotiable criterion. If the author didn't have the later scene in mind, it's not foreshadowing. It's something else wearing foreshadowing skin. Which brings us to the second category. Retrofitting is when an author takes an older, vague, or flexible element and assigns it a new, more specific meaning later, making it look planned in hindsight. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most long serials stay alive past year 5. You drop a mysterious masked guy, or a throwaway prophecy, or a half-explained power system, and then, 10 volumes later, you decide what it really meant, all along. In practice, that means the vase on the shelf suddenly becomes Chekhov's gun. You didn't put the vase there knowing it would matter, you just needed set dressing. But when you reach for a weapon in Act 3 and realize, oh, I already drew a heavy object on page 2, you grab it, you swing the vase. Retrofits can be elegant, they can be clumsy, but they are fundamentally later decisions stapled onto earlier material. Except, here's the thing, with Oda, those 2 categories still don't cover the weirdest stuff, because he's not only planting guns, and he's not only weaponizing vases after the fact, he's doing something in between. I need you to sit with this. There isn't a perfect academic term for what he's doing, so I'm going to call it pre-writing. Pre-writing is when an author knows the ending, knows the major plot points, knows the big reveals before publication, but hasn't fully assigned every detail to every scene yet. The decision exists, but the implementation is fuzzy. In our gun metaphor, this is the author knowing, in the outline, someone will get shot here, but not knowing whether it's with a pistol, a rifle, or a harpoon gun fired from a giant ship, Noah. So you get 3 objects in the room. Chekhov's gun on the mantelpiece, pure foreshadowing. A random vase that only becomes important when you're desperate in chapter 600, retrofitting. And then this third thing. The author has a sticky note that just says, shooting. And every time they design a room, they quietly make sure there's something that could plausibly be used as the weapon. In theory, writing manuals pretend you should only use the first category. In reality, in messy, year 25 serialization, all 3 are constantly bleeding into each other. This is normal. This is fine. And once you accept that, Joy Boy's promise, the Fishman Island legend, and that apologetic poneglyph start to look a lot less straightforward than the fandom meme version you've probably absorbed. Because if we can sort which parts were foreshadowed, which were retrofitted, and which were born from pre-writing, we can finally ask the dangerous question. What if Joy Boy's promise was never actually to the Fishmen at all? Why weekly manga can't be a 25-year 4D chess plan? So before we start rearranging Joy Boy's promise, we need to drag everyone back down to earth for a second. I need you to step out of the conspiracy corkboard mindset and into a fluorescent lit office in Shueisha. Because none of this Oda planned every panel 25 years ago stuff makes sense unless you understand how inhuman the weekly grind actually is. Here's the thing. A Jump author is doing a 19-page chapter every 7 days. Storyboards, pencils, inks, tones, corrections, meetings, every single week. You turn in on Monday, you get notes, you tweak, you collapse, and then you wake up, and the demon calendar has looped back to day one. On top of that, you've got editorial meetings where a guy with a spreadsheet reminds you your ranking dropped 2 spots because some high school rom-com did a beach chapter. The psychological toll is insane. You are not a 4D chess grandmaster serenely moving pieces on a 25-year board. You are a sleep-deprived goblin mainlining coffee, trying not to die, while strangers in a survey box decide whether your life's work is kinda mid this week. And the community still talks about Oda as if he's some omniscient god who intentionally planned every eyebrow twitch in Chapter 12 to foreshadow a reveal in Chapter 1012. Listen to me. No human brain is doing that under those conditions without adjusting course. Because here's what's actually happening behind the curtain. Reader surveys come in. Volume sales spike on a certain arc. An editor says, "Hey, can we get to Marineford faster?" Or, "Can you stay on 1.0 a bit longer? The numbers are good." Suddenly, an arc you outlined for 6 months gets compressed into 3, or a side character who was supposed to vanish after one gag becomes a fan favorite. You now have to weave into the main plot. This is normal. This is not a sin. This is how most serialized storytelling survives. And when that happens, authors start retrofitting. You go back to that weird line you tossed in 3 years ago, that minor design detail, that throwaway legend, and you reinterpret it to serve the new direction. The earlier thing didn't have a specific intentional meaning at the time. Now it becomes a seed. The magic trick is that to fans, it reads as immaculate foreshadowing. To the author, it's, oh thank God, a loose thread I can yank on. Oda is exceptional, not because he never does this, but because he's running both systems at once. He has a pre-written spine, Void Century, Will of D, Joy Boy, the ending. And then, under weekly pressure, he retrofits around that spine with absurd elegance. He takes an old panel, an old poneglyph, an old gag, and bends it so cleanly into the planned structure that you swear it was always intentional. Which means when we talk about Joy Boy's promise, we have to ask, which parts were on the spine and which parts were the retrofit? Because once you see that distinction, Fishman Island's legend starts to wobble in a very specific way. Real foreshadowing. The strict standard we're using. So if Fishman Island's legend is wobbling, we need to tighten the floor under it. We need to get brutally clear on what we're even calling foreshadowing before we start accusing Oda of 500-chapter galaxy brain planning or, on the other end, happy accident fan fiction. Here's the thing. Foreshadowing, in the strict sense I'm using, is not earlier thing that later feels relevant. Foreshadowing is when an author intentionally puts something in the story because the later payoff was already decided. Not vaguely imagined. Not, I'll do something cool with this someday. Decided. The setup exists because the answer was already on the page in the outline. I need you to sit with that causal arrow. The payoff doesn't grow out of the setup. The setup is a breadcrumb thrown down by a payoff that already exists in the author's head or notebook. That's the standard. That's the category. Everything else might be good writing, might be fun coincidence, might be clever retrofitting. It is not foreshadowing under this definition. So, simple narrative example. In Act 1, I show you a gun on the mantelpiece. The characters talk about it. We get a close-up. There is no other plausible reason for that gun to be there. It's not decoration. It's not world building about gun laws. It's not a joke about Grandpa's hunting days. Then, in Act 3, that exact gun is fired in the climax, resolving the central conflict in a way that clearly depended on it existing. That's textbook foreshadowing, and it only counts because when I wrote Act 1, I had already planned Act 3. Now, imagine a softer version. I mention, offhand, that the town has a weapons shop. 3 arcs later, I decide, oh, it'd be neat if the final battle happens there, and I drag that shot back into focus. Does it kind of fit? Sure. Does it feel smooth on a reread? Absolutely. But unless I had that final battle planned when I first mentioned the shop, it's not foreshadowing. It's retrofitting. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how most serialized storytelling survives week to week. The problem is that our community has started calling every echo, every parallel, every reused noun insane foreshadowing. You see a panel from chapter 80 that sort of rhymes with chapter 1080, and suddenly we're pattern-seeking monkeys seeing Jesus in toast. This is fine if we're just having fun, but it completely nukes our ability to measure what Oda actually planned. Because listen to me, most competent authors are doing that gun on the mantelpiece level of planning constantly. That's the floor, not the ceiling. So when we talk about Joy Boy's promise, we're going to apply this strict test. Was that apology line on the Fishman Island poneglyph written with a fixed, known payoff about the Fishmen specifically? Or was it always pointing at something broader, with Fishman Island later wrapping their own trauma around it? And if the earlier line wasn't truly constrained by a fishman-shaped answer, then the whole legend you've been repeating for 10 years might be standing on sand, which is where this gets uncomfortable. Retrofitting, the art of making it look planned. So here's where a lot of you start to sweat, because if that legend is standing on sand, then a bunch of your favorite Oda planned this from day one. Threads start to wobble with it. Listen to me. Wobbling is not the end of the world. Wobbling is where the craft actually gets interesting. We need to put a clean label on what's happening here. Retrofitting is when an author takes something they wrote earlier, something broad, ambiguous, or just emotionally charged but legally vague, and later assigns it a precise meaning that wasn't fully locked in at the start. The line was, "Joy Boy failed to keep a promise." The retrofit is, that promise was about Fishman Island, the Noah, Poseidon, and the path to the surface. That second part is not baked into the first. It's layered onto it. And here's the thing. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, how most long-running serialized stories avoid collapsing under their own weight. You publish chapter 200 before you've lived through the life experiences that give you the idea for chapter 900. You leave yourself wiggle room. You keep the wording of the poneglyph as an apology, not a contract with a specific race, so that when you later decide what Poseidon actually is, you can snap those pieces together without breaking anything. The quality test is not, was this perfectly, immaculately planned in 1997? The quality test is, does the retrofit feel organic, respect earlier constraints, and deepen the themes? Good retrofits work within the negative space of what's already on the page. The Fishman Island poneglyph never states, Joy Boy promised the fishmen a condo on the surface by 1522. It's an apology addressed to Poseidon. So when Oda clarifies that Poseidon is a mermaid princess who commands sea kings, and that the Noah is meant to be pulled by those sea kings for some future world-scale operation, he's not contradicting anything. He's specifying. Bad retrofits, by contrast, trample the record. They say, Toby was always this guy, when earlier chapters literally say otherwise. They ask you to memory hole panels. That's the problem. Oda, very pointedly, does not do that with Joy Boy. He keeps the early language loose enough that the later Fishman Island mythology can be a local interpretation rather than the original clause. Now, here's where the community and the author part ways. Fans want everything to be 4D chess. Every panel a prophecy. Every background fish a secret roadmap. Because you and I are pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in Toast and Gear 5 in random sundoodles. Authors, on the other hand, want flexibility. They want to discover better ideas 10 years in and still be able to fold them back into the spine of the story without snapping it. This is normal. This is fine. Serialization is not a sacred contract to never change your mind. It's a very public first draft that lasts decades. And once you accept that, you can start to see what's actually happening with Joy Boy. A broad, ancient apology gets retrofitted into Fishman Island's personal trauma narrative. Otohime, Fisher Tiger, Neptune, they wrap their suffering around a vague poneglyph and turn it into our promise. In the next section, I want to pull that apart and ask a worse question. What if Joy Boy's real promise was never to them at all? Pre-writing the Oda-style half-planned future. So here's where I'm going to cheat a little and invent a word. I'm calling this whole Joy Boy / Poseidon / Noah mess pre-writing. This is not a real academic term. This is me, a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, trying to give you a handle for what Oda is actually doing, so you don't have to call every coincidence 20 years of foreshadowing and move on. Pre-writing, in this context, is when an author has broad structural decisions nailed down, but the micro-level details are still foggy. Not Joy Boy will apologize to Shirahoshi on page 13 of chapter 649. More, there was a guy in the Void Century who failed a promise involving the sea, Poseidon, and a huge ship. The skeleton is planned. The organs get swapped in later. This is normal. This is how long-form storytelling survives more than 3 volumes without collapsing under its own retcons. So when I say Oda is a pre-writer, I need you to understand the scale of that claim. We're not talking about, oh, he decided on Gear 5 during Dressrosa. We're talking, before Chapter 1, he already knew there was a Void Century, an ancient kingdom, 3 ancient weapons, and a goofy rubber boy who would eventually be revealed as a sun god tied to an ancient promise. The difference is massive. One is clever improv. The other is a 25-year slow release of a document he wrote in his 20s. Listen to me. An author can absolutely know. There will be 3 ancient weapons. One will be a person who commands sea kings. One will be a ship. One will be something else entirely, long before they know the names Shirahoshi, Pluton, Uranus, or Noah. You can pre-write the categories, the roles, the thematic jobs those weapons do in the story, and only later decide which arc, which island, which cute crying mermaid gets stapled to which slot. That's why we need this 3rd category. Foreshadowing is when you intentionally plant a detail for a payoff you already see clearly. Retrofitting is when you go back to old material and assign it new meaning. Pre-writing sits in between. The intent is real, but blurry. The pieces are fixed, but the edges are soft. When Oda first scribbles, Joy Boy fails Poseidon in a notebook, that's not a Fishman Island scene yet. That's a floating node on a conspiracy board. And here's the thing. Joy Boy's promise, Noah's purpose, and Poseidon's role almost certainly lived in that pre-writing space for years. Oda knew there was an apology poneglyph. He knew there was a mermaid princess weapon. He knew there was a giant ark hauled by sea kings. But this becomes the personal salvation myth of Fishman Island feels later. It feels like the moment where a broad, ancient failure gets localized into Otterheim's dream and Neptune's guilt, which is why the interpretation can drift. The community treats Fishman Island's reading of that poneglyph as gospel, when it might just be one island plugging its trauma into an 800-year-old template. In the next section, I want to show you what happens when we peel Fishman Island out of that template and ask, what was the pre-written version aiming at before they grabbed it? A safer battlefield. How Naruto's Toby twist was really built. So to peel Fishman Island out of that template, we need a safer battlefield. We need a case where the community swore something was 4D chess foreshadowing, the author later admitted it wasn't that planned, and yet the twist still hits. Enter Naruto. Enter the mask. Enter Toby. Quick recap so we're on the same page. For years you've got this goofy, Toby is a good boy idiot in an orange mask, then suddenly he's, actually I'm Madara, then even later the big reveal, no, he's Obito, Kakashi's dead teammate from the flashbacks. And the second that chapter dropped, the fandom turned into a CSI lab. People were posting panels, arrows, red circles, entire dissertations about how it was obvious all along. Mask has one eye hole, Obito only has one eye. Personality shift after Deidara dies. Clearly trauma from the rock incident. His jutsu involves warping space. Well, Kakashi's eye does that too. He knows Kakashi's moves, he targets Konoha, he fixates on Rin. The community built this museum of foreshadowing and then charged admission. Except, here's the thing. When you slow down and take the fan goggles off, a lot of those hints are just flexible. One eye hole on a mask works for any mysterious Uchiha with a Sharingan. A goofy persona that drops when things get serious is standard anime villain behavior. A guy who hates Konoha and knows its jutsu could be Obito, sure, but he could also be some rando ANBU, a Zetsu fusion, a time-traveling squirrel, whatever Kishimoto needed that week. And Kishimoto has basically said as much. In interviews, he's admitted Toby's identity wasn't nailed down from Chapter 1. At different stages, Toby was going to just be Madara for real, or some kind of vessel, before he circled back around to Obito because the Kakashi connection gave him more emotional payoff. That is not the behavior of a man who had a 10-year Obito storyboard pinned to his wall. So what actually happened? Retrofitting. He had a vague, masked antagonist with Uchiha ties. He kept the details foggy on purpose. Then, once he decided, okay, it's Obito, he went back through the toolbox of earlier ambiguity and started assigning meaning. The mask design becomes Obito's eye. The goofy act becomes Obito's coping mechanism. The space-warping jutsu becomes Kakashi parallel. None of those panels were hard-coded to Obito when they were drawn. They were generic enough that they could be bent toward Obito later. And then, crucially, the story after the reveal keeps pointing back to them and saying, see how intentional this was? Listen to me. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how a lot of long-running manga survive weekly serialization without the author's brain melting out their ears. And here's the twist that matters for us. The Obito reveal still works for a ton of fans. It's still emotionally effective. You still feel Kakashi's guilt, Obito's bitterness, the tragedy of the cycle. It just isn't a pristine, decade-long foreshadowing master plan. It's a retrofit that was then dressed up as foreshadowing after the fact. So, hold that in your head, because in the next section, I'm going to ask you a very uncomfortable question. What if Joy Boy's promise to Fishman Island is doing the exact same trick? Why this matters before we touch Joy Boy. So here's where this gets dangerous for us as a community. If every clean, emotionally satisfying payoff gets thrown into the foreshadowing bucket, we start quietly rewriting how writing actually works. We don't just praise an author for a good twist. We reverse engineer a myth where they had a stone tablet of the entire story sitting on their desk from Chapter 1 and never deviated once. And listen to me, that almost never happens. When you call every coincidence, every retrofit, every "oh wow, that lines up" moment foreshadowing, you're not just being generous. You're upgrading "this was cleverly solved later" into "this was immutably planned from the start." That's a different category. That's a different claim. And once you make that jump, you end up in Joy Boy conspiracy land. Because then the assumption becomes, of course Oda knew Joy Boy's promise, word for word, panel for panel, as a Fishman Island contract in 1997. Of course he had a crystal clear Fishman-specific "I will take your people to the surface" script written before Reverse Mountain. Any ambiguity we see now? That's just Oda being mysterious, not Oda leaving himself room. Do you see the problem? I need you to notice how fast that escalates. We go from "this was a good payoff" to "this was always the plan" to "Joy Boy failed one marginalized race and now Luffy will redeem that exact failure" in about 3 wiki articles. And then that fanon hardens into canon in people's heads to the point where questioning it feels heretical. Here's the thing. I'm not doing this to demote Oda's genius. I'm doing this to actually find it. The goal is not gotcha, he didn't plan that. The goal is to sort the tools on the workbench. Where is he using real foreshadowing, where the setup and payoff were both known? Where is he retrofitting, taking an old element and assigning it new significance? And where is he relying on pre-written scaffolding, that giant invisible outline of the Void Century, the ancient weapons, the endgame that existed before Chapter 1 and gets revealed in chunks? Once you apply that lens, Fishman Island shifts. It stops reading as "Joy Boy made a solemn promise to our one oppressed race and failed us personally," and starts reading as "this one island inherited, misheard, and localized a global mission." Neptune, Otohime, Fisher Tiger, all filtering an 800-year-old apology through their own trauma. until Poseidon and Noah and the surface become a Fishman-specific prophecy instead of a world-scale operation. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how cultures remix old stories. Pattern interrupt. What if the poneglyph never actually says what you think it says? Because that's where we're going next. We're going to crack open that Fishman Island poneglyph scene, word by word. We're going to look at what Joy Boy's apology does say, what it very conspicuously doesn't say, how Neptune describes Poseidon, what the Sea Kings mutter about that person, and how all of that lines up with Oda's pre-written endgame rather than the fandom's Fishman-only myth. And if that sounds uncomfortable, good. We need to sit in that discomfort before we can see what promise Joy Boy actually made. Reading the stone. What the Fishman Island poneglyph actually says. So to sit in that discomfort, we need to do the extremely unsexy thing. Actually read the rock. On Fishman Island, Robin walks into the sea forest, puts her hand on that blue poneglyph, and Oda quietly labels it for us. Not a road poneglyph, not a weapon blueprint, a historical poneglyph. Category matters. This is the author tapping the glass and saying, hey, this one is a record, not a recipe. It's not instructions. It's not a contract. It's a diary entry carved in indestructible stone. And what does that diary entry say? Robin reads that Joy Boy tried to raise Noah with Poseidon's help, failed to keep a promise, and carved an apology. The text explicitly connects the apology to Poseidon. It does not say to the Fishmen. It does not say to Fishman Island. It does not say to all underwater peoples terms and conditions apply. It's Joy Boy talking to Poseidon about a broken agreement involving Noah and the Sea Kings. Here's the thing. An apology is not the same category as the original deal. An apology is a reaction. It's the aftermath. I'm sorry I couldn't keep our promise is fundamentally different from I, Joy Boy, hereby swear to relocate Fishmen to the surface continent by Q4 of the Void Century. The stone is regret, not terms of service. The problem is, our community keeps treating this as if Oda printed the whole contract on screen, when he very intentionally only shows us the I'm sorry email, not the original thread. And Oda doubles down on that gap in story. Robin never says, he promised to bring Fishmen to the surface. She reports what's actually there. Joy Boy, Poseidon, Noah, failure, apology, full stop. Then Neptune steps in and does what every pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast does. He fills the silence with his own expectations. He tells Robin about the ancient ship, about the legend that one day Noah will be used to move Fishman Island, and he stitches that onto Joy Boy's apology until they feel inseparable. Neptune explicitly connects it to our dream of going to the surface. Not because the stone says that, but because his people's suffering and Otohime's campaign have primed him to hear the word promise and mentally auto-complete it with to us. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is what humans and fishmen and fans all do in storytelling. We retrofit vague text into the shape of our pain. Listen to me. Textually, the Fishman Island poneglyph does not say, Joy Boy promised to bring Fishmen to the surface. That sentence lives entirely in the characters' heads. The carved record is an apology to Poseidon about a failed operation involving Noah and the Sea Kings. And once you separate the literal wording from Neptune's very understandable inference, you open a much more uncomfortable door. If the stone doesn't specify the beneficiary of the promise, then who was Joy Boy actually planning all this for? I need you to hold that question, because the answer is where Oda's pre-writing really starts to show its teeth. Neptune's story versus the stone's words. So let's actually put Neptune on the stand for a second, because once you do a close read of his dialogue, the whole Joy Boy promised to save the Fishman thing starts wobbling. I need you to hear the difference between what the stone says and what Neptune has decided it must mean. He starts very formal. This is a historical document passed down on Fishman Island. That's him pointing at the poneglyph. Objective. Then, It contains an apology from a man named Joy Boy to the mermaid princess of that time. That's crucial. The addressee is singular. It's Poseidon, not my dear oppressed underwater community. Already narrower than the myth. Then he goes, "We have inherited that apology and the promise bound to it." Notice that shift. The stone never says, "Fishman Island, you are now contractually entitled to X." Neptune is the one dragging his entire people under the umbrella of a letter addressed to one girl who could talk to sea kings. Here's the thing, he moves from quotation to interpretation mid-sentence, and most fans never notice because we're busy crying over Joy Boy's failure. He keeps going. One day, when the promised time comes, Fishman Island will be moved. That line is doing a ton of unspoken work. The poneglyph mentions Noah, mentions Poseidon, mentions a failed plan. It does not stamp a relocation voucher for every citizen under 10,000 meters. Fishman Island will be moved is Neptune extrapolating the logistics of a ship guided by sea kings into a full-blown racial exodus prophecy. And he admits the core thing outright. The poneglyph is to Poseidon, not to Neptune, not to Artoheim, not to the Ryugu kingdom and all affiliated merfolk and fishmen. Terms and conditions apply. But every time he explains it, he frames it as Fishman Island's destiny, Fishman Island's burden, Fishman Island's dream, addressed to one weapon, claimed by an entire nation. Is that malicious? No, this is not a sin. This is what rulers do when their people have been stepped on for centuries. When you're sitting at the bottom of the ocean, watching your kids get trafficked and your heroes die, any ancient apology about failure and a future promised time starts to sound very specifically about you. We need to admit that if you hand a traumatized community a vague letter from God, they will read their pain into every line. This is normal. You see this in real-world storytelling all the time. Broad religious texts that originally talk about cosmic renewal somehow become, and also, our village will be saved from the flood. Empires claim that the Messiah is definitely on their payroll. Every small group turns the wide-angle lens into a selfie. I do this when I see foreshadowing in my own life, because I'm a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. So no, Neptune isn't lying. He's doing extremely human, extremely understandable retrofitting. He's taken an apology addressed to an ancient weapon in a global plan and localized it into a promise tailored for Fishman liberation. And listen to me, that retrofit has real power. It shapes Otoheim, it shapes Fisher Tiger, it shapes Shirahoshi. But if the king is already bending the letter this far for his people, how far has our entire fandom been bending? Joy Boy's promise for our pet theories. Otohime, Fisher Tiger, and the emotional hijacking of a legend. So when you zoom out from Neptune's very convenient interpretation, you hit the next problem. His kids grow up on that version. Otohime and Fisher Tiger are not historians. They are not void-century scholars. They are traumatized political actors handed a half-understood apology and told, "Some great man once cared about you," and they run with it. Otohime first. Her whole campaign is built on a promised future. Not a detailed policy document, not a trade agreement, a vibe. She stands in the plaza, grabbing signatures, sobbing in front of a burning ship, begging her people to believe that one day fishmen will walk the surface hand in hand with humans. And here's the thing. She sells that dream as if the universe has already stamped it approved. The day will come. We must be ready when that time arrives. She talks in prophetic tense, not hypothetical tense. Where does that certainty come from? Not the poneglyph. The stone never says surface, it never says integration. It's an apology to Poseidon tied to the Noah and some deferred plan. But in Otoheime's speeches, in Neptune's soft focus flashbacks, the surface is framed almost as a scheduled event. The story she's heard, filtered through Neptune's dad brain and royal myth, becomes a great promise was made concerning this island and the world above. We just have to align ourselves with it. That is emotional foreshadowing, not textual evidence. Then Fisher Tiger blows everything up, literally and narratively. He's the counterpoint. He climbs Mary Geoise, frees slaves, brands the sun over the hoof, and his message is not integration, it's never trust humans again. But listen to me. He still leans on the same hazy someday. He refuses to take human blood. He refuses the world government's authority, and yet his crew sails under a banner of eventual freedom. Not next week. Someday. You hear it in how the Sun Pirates talk to Koala, in how Arlong later weaponizes that frustration. This world will change. We just have to endure until then. That's Otohime's deferred hope, stripped of pacifism and dipped in acid. So you end up with two competing narratives, the Queen's peaceful petition and the rebels' scarred rage. Both orbiting an 800-year-old apology none of them can actually read firsthand. They're inheriting a legend that was already warped by royal retelling, and then they re-warp it through their own agendas. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how human brains handle myth. Pattern interrupt. What if Joy Boy never promised any of this to them? Watch the specific scenes. Neptune talking to Robin in the sea forest, reverently tying the Noah, Poseidon, and the surface together, as if the stone literally spelled out Fishman Relocation Program. Otohime telling her children that the world above will surely accept them one day, because there are those who will understand. None of that is in the inscription. That's extrapolation turned doctrine. By the time Luffy shows up, the category has shifted. Joy Boy's original, world-scale plan has been emotionally hijacked into a local prophecy. Someone will save the Fishmen. The author gave us an apology to a weapon. The community on Fishman Island turned it into a rescue ticket. And I need you to hold that in your head, because the next step is asking, if even they rewrote Joy Boy to fit their pain, what do you think we've been doing as fans for 25 years? Poseidon, not Fishman Island. Who was Joy Boy talking to? So we need to do something mildly painful here. We need to stop talking about Joy Boy's promise to Fishman Island and actually read the object in the room, the poneglyph, the brick of cannon. Because when Neptune translates it, he doesn't say, "To my beloved oppressed fish people, sorry bros." He says it's an apology to Poseidon, not to a race, not to a kingdom, to an ancient weapon. Here's the thing, that's insane, and nobody in the community treats it as insane because we've all smoothed it over in our heads. Oh, Joy Boy, patron saint of racial equality, tragically failed his promise to the Fishmen. That's comforting. That's emotionally tidy. But the author did not write that. The author wrote an apology addressed to a mermaid who is also a doomsday device. Poseidon is not a flag. Poseidon is not a government. Poseidon is a person who reincarnates as a mermaid princess who can command sea kings. Period. That's the definition. In the Void Century, there was a Poseidon. In Shirahoshi's time, there is a Poseidon. Same title, different girl, same terrifying power to tell kaiju the size of continents, where to go and what to do. So when Joy Boy carves "My bad Poseidon" into indestructible stone, he is not writing a political apology letter to Fishman Island's Ministry of Civil Rights. He is apologizing to a weapon-person hybrid whose whole deal is global ocean control. That immediately pushes the promise into a different category. You don't say sorry to a nuke because you failed to get one town better housing. You say sorry because some planned, coordinated use of that nuke didn't happen. And the manga quietly backs this up. The Noah is explicitly described as a ship meant to be moved by Sea Kings under Poseidon's command. The Sea Kings themselves talk about waiting for their queen and that person to guide them someday. This is infrastructure. This is logistics. This is a pre-written world-scale operation that needed Poseidon as the central processor, not a charity cruise for one oppressed demographic. Now yes, Fishman Island is where Poseidon tends to be born. It's where the Noah is parked. It's geographically convenient. This is fine. This is normal. It makes sense to stash your god mermaid and your world ship in the same underwater bunker. But proximity does not equal primary beneficiary. Just because the rocket is sitting on your lawn doesn't mean the mission is about your house. So listen to me. If the apology is to Poseidon, and Poseidon's power literally reaches every sea on the planet, why are we so sure the promise was only about one race's migration plan? Why would a weapon that can mobilize every Sea King be overkill for a single island civil rights arc? I need you to sit with that discomfort, because once you accept the promise was global in scope, you have to ask a much worse question. What exactly were Joy Boy and Poseidon trying to do to the entire world? The Noah, a ship built for a world, not just one island. And this is where the Noah strolls in and quietly blows up the refugee ferry headcanon the community has been nursing for a decade. Look at the thing. Noah isn't a ship. It's a floating continent with rigging. It's so huge it has to be dragged by Sea Kings just to move, which already tells you we're not talking about a weekend cruise for one island's worth of merfolk. You don't design a vessel that needs living kaiju engines if your planned use case is evacuate Fishman Island once and call it a day. That's bad engineering, bad logistics, and worse storytelling. Here's the thing. Neptune doesn't call it our national escape boat. He calls it the Ark of the Oath. That wording is doing a lot of work. Ark puts it in the category of mythic reset tools. Noah's Ark, lifeboat for a world event. Oath ties it to a specific promise. And crucially, its activation is explicitly bound to Poseidon's command over the Sea Kings. The author is telling you this structure is hardwired into the ancient weapon system, not some bespoke Fishman Island humanitarian project. And notice where it is. Noah is stored near Fishman Island, looming above the district, but nobody there built it. Nobody there can repair it, and Neptune speaks about it more as a caretaker than an owner. It's a relic parked at their front door, waiting for a key they don't fully understand. This is not a sin. This is normal when you inherit technology from a civilization that was playing 5D chess while you're still chewing on crayons. The Sea Kings make this even harder to ignore. When Luffy damages Noah, they don't go, "Oh no, there goes the Fishman relocation plan." They panic because the ship is important to that day. They talk about waiting for their queen and a certain person who will guide them. That's foreshadowing, not for a local civil rights victory, but for a coordinated, world-spanning operation where Sea Kings are the logistics department, Poseidon is the dispatcher, and Noah is the central hardware. I need you to clock the difference here. Fishman Island sees a big boat and a legend about the surface and assumes very reasonably that the story is about them. The text, the design, the reactions all scream something else. A planned global-scale migration or reset event involving the entire ocean. The ship's proportions, the ancient weapon tie-in, the reverent way even Sea Kings talk about that day, all point in the same direction. So when fans reduce Noah to Fishman refugee ship, we're doing the pattern-seeking monkey thing again, seeing Jesus in toast and calling it foreshadowing. We need to ask a much uglier question. If this ark wasn't built just to move one persecuted race, what exactly is supposed to be loaded onto it when that day finally arrives? And who decided that? The Sea King's prophecy, waiting for a queen and that person. So, if Noah isn't just a Fishman U-Haul, we need to talk about the only characters who actually know what it's for, the Sea Kings. Because once you listen to what they say, out loud in the manga, the Joy Boy promised to move Fishman to the surface. Reading starts to look incredibly small. Go back to Shirahoshi's awakening. She's crying, the Sea Kings swarm, and they don't go, "Ah yes, our tool to help one oppressed island." They say, "Our queen is born in this era." They talk about guiding us. They explicitly frame her as Poseidon, their ruler, finally reappearing after centuries. That's monarch of the ocean language. That's not local activist. Then you hit the Noah incident, and Oda just rips the training wheels off. As Luffy's trying to smash the ark, the Sea Kings show up and start monologuing again. That ship, it must not be destroyed. We were told to protect it until that day. And then the big one. They say their queen and that person will lead them into a new era, not a better decade for Fishman Island. a new era, planetary scale wording. Here's the thing. When giant primordial sea gods start talking about eras, you should probably take them at their word. These are beings who outlive kingdoms. Their frame of reference is the whole ocean, not one bubble under the red line. If their prophecy is our queen plus that person equals new era, shrinking that down to help the Fishmen move house is us doing the pattern-seeking monkey thing again. And then Oda drops the generational relay. During that same sequence, the Sea Kings casually mention, "We heard that voice before, from that man, Roger." Later, they recognize Luffy's voice the same way. This isn't random telepathy. This is a chain of custody. Roger hears the Sea Kings, realizes he's too early, laughs, and walks away. Luffy hears them, same power, different timing. The will is literally being passed down the line while the mission stays constant. Now plug Joy Boy into that timeline. The Sea Kings talk about Noah, about that day, about an era shift, and we know from Neptune that the poneglyph is Joy Boy apologizing to Poseidon. Not to the Fishmen as a political entity, to Poseidon, their queen. From the Sea King's perspective, Joy Boy is just one failed attempt in a very long series of coordinated moves to trigger this ocean-wide era change. Pattern interrupt for your brain. If the Sea Kings themselves are thinking in eras and oceans, why are we insisting the promise was about one island's real estate problem? That's a storytelling category error. We're taking global, planned, author-level foreshadowing and cramming it into a local myth because the characters on Fishman Island did the same thing. This is not a sin. This is normal. People reinterpret old prophecies through their own trauma all the time, which means the next step is brutal but necessary. I need you to separate what Joy Boy actually promised from what Ottoheim, Fisher Tiger, and Neptune wanted that promise to be. Roger Laughtail and the echo of a broken promise. So if Fishman Island has been holding on to the echo, we need to go back to the source. Because the one crew that actually heard the full song of Joy Boy's story did not walk away going, "Wow, tragic Fishman-only side quest." Roger gets to Laughtail, reads the true history, learns about Joy Boy, the ancient weapons, the whole erased century. This is not a vague vibe check. This is a data dump. The man literally had Odin transcribing poneglyphs in his travel journal. And when they finally reach the final island, what happens? They laugh. They laugh so hard, Roger names the place after it. Now listen to me. If the emotional centerpiece of that revelation was, this guy failed to save one persecuted undersea kingdom, you would feel that in the crew's reaction. You'd get anger or sorrow, or at least a moment of, we have to fix this one specific injustice. Instead, the tone is cosmic prank. It's, we were too early, not, we met the wrong fish. Here's the thing. The only time we actually see Roger emotionally rattled by the Joy Boy plan is not at Fishman Island. It's when he hears the Sea Kings during Odin's flashback. He suddenly understands their words, realizes Poseidon will be born in the future, and he breaks. He's crying, laughing, apologizing to a world that isn't ready yet. The key line is timing. He was too early. Wrong era, wrong alignment of pieces, wrong generation for the promised event. That timing detail is your category shift. Joy Boy's promise is not framed as, I will personally escort Fishmen to the surface. It's framed as, at a specific future moment, when Poseidon and a certain person meet, the world will change. That is a scheduled global event, not a single kingdom relocation program. And what does Roger do with that information? He doesn't rush back to Neptune and say, my bad, let me manually complete your racial integration arc. He retires. He turns himself in. Then he weaponizes his execution into a global call to arms. The Great Pirate Era is him kicking the can down the road, scattering maniacs across the seas on a treasure hunt so that one of them, someday, will stumble into the exact alignment Joy Boy's plan required. If the core of the promise were save Fishman Island, that is a bizarre strategy. You would expect Roger's reflections to center on Fishman, on Otoheime's dream, on Noah. Instead, All his language is about the world, the next generation, those who will find the treasure. The fishmen barely register in his monologues. I need you to see the foreshadowing pattern here. The only characters who reduce Joy Boy to our undersea savior are the ones trapped under the red line. The only characters who know the script treat it as a planetary rewrite cued to a calendar. Which means the real question isn't, why did Joy Boy fail Fishman Island? It's what world-scale promise was so big that Fishman Island could misread it as their own. Inherited will versus localized myth. How stories shrink over time. So when I say what world-scale promise was so big that Fishman Island could misread it as their own, I'm really asking you to zoom out, way out, because we're about to separate inherited will from hometown fanfiction, and those are not the same storytelling category at all. Inherited will in One Piece is the big stuff. It's the broad ideals and long missions that keep jumping hosts across centuries. People's dreams never end. The will of D. The ancient kingdoms fight against a world order that outlived them. The author is very intentional about this. The details rot, the context evaporates, but the emotional core survives. Freedom, dawn, breaking the cage. That's inherited will. Now contrast that with what I'll call localized myth. That's when a community grabs a tiny surviving shard of that big story and says, "Oh, that's about us. We are the chosen ones." The scale shrinks. The nuance dies. The global becomes parochial. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, how human brains cope with cosmic narratives. We drag them down to street level so we can sleep at night. Wano is your clean example. At some point, the Kozuki clan helped record Void Century history, knew about Joy Boy, knew about the opening of the world. 800 years later, that gigantic planetary agenda has turned into a Wano-specific destiny plot. A certain man will appear, open the borders, the closed country, the prophecy, the samurai martyr complex. It's all a localized myth built on a fragment of inherited will. The original plan was change the world order. Wano retells it as fix our borders and our shogun problem. Fishman Island does the same thing, just with more trauma. Neptune literally tells us the poneglyph is Joy Boy apologizing to Poseidon. Not to the Fishman race, to Poseidon. The Noah is a ship designed to be hauled by sea kings under her command. The Sea Kings talk about waiting for their queen and that person to guide them for a world-changing event. That's global infrastructure. That's not a bespoke discrimination fix package for one island under the red line. But if you are that island, if your community has been enslaved, hunted, and shoved under the ocean for centuries, of course you recenter the story. Otohime hears about the surface and turns it into civil rights activism. Fisher Tiger's scars become the lens for every legend. Neptune reads an 800-year-old apology and his brain, very reasonably, goes, Joy Boy failed our people. We need to be honest. We would do the same thing. I need you to admit you'd turn any vague ancient promise into this will fix my problem faster than a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. So here's the thing. Joy Boy's inherited will was probably a world-level restructuring involving Poseidon and the ancient kingdom's dream. Fishman Island's version, Joy Boy will take us to the surface and end racism, is a localized myth built on that echo. This is fine. This is normal. But if that's true, then the next question is brutal. If Joy Boy's promise wasn't really about them, what happens when Luffy finally keeps it? Is Joy Boy's promise about the whole world instead? So here's where we need to zoom out, because if you stay at Fishman Island scale, the whole thing looks tragic and personal. Joy Boy failed them, end of story. But the second you stack all the clues in one frame, the Poseidon focus, the Sea King's weird era language, the Noah's absurd size, Roger literally saying, we were too early. You stop seeing a neighborhood promise and start seeing a global operation. Listen to me. The poneglyph isn't, Dear Fishman, sorry I didn't end racism. Neptune explicitly says it's an apology to Poseidon. That's already a different category of commitment. Poseidon is an ancient weapon, a world-shaping entity, and the Sea Kings talk about her in those terms. They're not waiting for the day Fishman Island is saved. They're waiting for the day their queen and another sovereign are born in the same era, so the world will be turned upside down. That's not civil rights legislation. That's a patch note for the entire planet. Here's the thing. Once you remember what Poseidon actually does, command Sea Kings, the Noah suddenly stops being a cute racial arc and starts looking like infrastructure. It's a ship so huge it physically cannot function without Sea Kings towing it. It's parked directly under the red line. It's explicitly called the Ship of Promise, so the intentional reading is not one island's moving truck. It's a modular piece in a much bigger design. Alter the seas, move massive populations, maybe even reroute how the world itself is connected. And now Roger's "we arrived too early" line clicks. He reaches Laugh-Tale, learns the Void Century truth. Here's the real Joy Boy plan. And what does he say? Not, "Wow, can't wait for Fishman Island to be free," but "we were too early, and someone will find that treasure and change the world." World, not district. The author could have written "save Fishman Island" there. He didn't. That's intentional foreshadowing of scale. Once you accept that, Fishman Island's liberation stops being the goal and becomes the side effect. If the seas are rearranged, if the red line is shattered, if the ancient kingdom's dream was a world where all peoples share the same sun and ocean, then of course fishmen reach the surface. You don't need a bespoke promise for that. When you uninstall the Celestial Dragon operating system, all the local bugs, the slavery, the segregation, the "you live under a rock ceiling forever" policy get patched automatically. And this model fits Oda's writing pattern way better. He never does isolated morality plays. Arlong Park isn't just Nami's trauma. It's a preview of systemic racism and world government-sanctioned exploitation. Eni's lobby isn't just Robin's sadness. It's a courtroom indictment of judicial farce. So why would Joy Boy's legendary failure be scoped to one oppressed race when every other major arc scales individual pain up into structural critique of the Celestial Dragon's world order? Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. If Joy Boy's promise was always world level, then what exactly did Fishman Island misunderstand for 800 years? And when Luffy finally executes the real plan, is he saving them or dragging them into a change they never actually agreed to? Luffy, Nika, and the rebranding of Joy Boy. And this is exactly where Luffy blows the whole Fishman-centric reading to pieces. Because once you introduce Nika, once you reveal that the Gomu Gomu no Mi was never rubber at all, but the Hito Hito no Mi model, Nika, you're not just slapping a sun god sticker on Luffy. You're reclassifying him. The text is telling you, this kid is literally embodying a myth about joy and liberation. The author hard swaps him into a freedom deity. That is not a small retcon. That is Oda planting a flag on what Joy Boy's category of promise actually was. Here's the thing. The Nika legend that Who's Who talks about in 1.0 is not. He once helped some fish people move house. It's a story whispered in slave ships and prison cells. It's a god who makes chains feel lighter, who makes people dance while they're still in shackles. That's global oppression energy. That's not a regional moving company. When the community turns that into Joy Boy's big mission was a real estate deal for Fishman Island, I need you to see how much you're shrinking the frame. And then you map that onto Luffy's actual track record. Alabasta. Topple a world government-backed tyrant. Expose Crocodile. Free an entire desert kingdom from a secret colonial extraction scheme. Dressrosa. Dethrone a Celestial Dragon proxy who literally manufactures toys and slaves. Unravel an underground weapons pipeline. 1.0. Overthrow a Yonko industrial complex feeding the world government. Liberate a closed nation and its labor camps. These aren't one-off pity saves. This is systemic regime change foreshadowing, executed arc after arc. Listen to me. The pattern is the point. If your Joy Boy promise theory can't survive contact with Luffy's established mission profile, your theory is the problem, not the story. Oda has been writing Luffy as a walking Nika function. Find oppression, break it, move on. That's intentional, that's planned, and it tells you what kind of promise Joy Boy would have made in the first place. Which means positioning Luffy as Joy Boy's successor only really makes sense if Joy Boy's original vow was Nika-shaped, world level, structure level, aimed at dismantling the Celestial Dragon's order itself. You don't hand the hat, the ship, the fruit, and the Ancient Kingdom's will to a guy whose endgame is relocate one island. That's a mismatch in storytelling scale so huge it would make Oda look incompetent. And whatever else we accuse this author of, we don't accuse him of forgetting his own escalation curve. Pattern interrupt. What if Fishman Island is just one stop on the route? Not the destination, not the final payoff of an 800-year plan, but a necessary node in a planet-wide network Joy Boy setup. This is not a sin. This is normal for long-form writing. You take a global agenda, it expresses locally. Otohime, Fisher Tiger, Neptune. They reinterpret a world promise through Fishman trauma. That's human. This is fine. So Luffy showing up as Nika at Fishman Island isn't, the prophecy was about us. It's, you're part of the same liberation cascade as Alabasta, Dressrosa, Wano, and whatever comes next. And we need to follow that thread, because the next section is where the ancient weapons, the Noah, and the Sea Kings quietly tell you who Joy Boy was really talking to. Re-examining Fishman Island. Setup, payoff, or retroactive plugin. So when we zoom into Fishman Island, I need you to keep that global liberation cascade in your head, because this is where the community usually trips. We see Joy Boy's name. We see a poneglyph. We see a crying king. Our pattern-seeking monkey brain that sees Jesus in toast goes, yes, this was all planned as the payoff to the Joy Boy mystery from day one. Except, was it? Here's the thing. Joy Boy is actually named on panel absurdly late compared to the rest of the endgame furniture. Void Century, Chapter 100s. Ancient Weapons, Alabasta. Poseidon as a term, Skypiea. Joy Boy as an actual proper noun. We don't get that until Fishman Island, hundreds of chapters in. That timing matters. It tells you Fishman Island isn't where Oda suddenly invented Joy Boy. It's where he finally cashes in a pre-written chip he's been sitting on since before Chapter 1. So which category is this? Foreshadowing, retrofit, or pre-writing? The answer is messy. The existence of a mermaid princess who can talk to sea kings, clearly tied to the weapon Poseidon, is hard foreshadowing. We get the concept in Skypiea, we get the silhouette and the once-in-an-age mermaid idea before we meet Shirahoshi, and then Fishman Island flips the card and says, yes, this is that thing. That's intentional, planned, classical foreshadowing. But the Fishman's specific framing of Joy Boy's promise, that smells more retrofit. Not in the sense that Oda made up Joy Boy on the spot, but in the sense that he took a pre-written global promise and let this one arc misunderstand it on purpose. The poneglyph doesn't actually say, "Dear Fishman, my bad." Neptune explicitly calls it an apology to Poseidon. The Noah is a ship meant to be moved by sea kings under Poseidon's command, not a custom U-Haul for one oppressed race. The infrastructure screams, world plan. The characters read it as our local prophecy. And this is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is normal high-level storytelling. An author with a fixed endpoint will often choose a thematically charged location to dump lore they already decided on. Fishman Island is perfect for that. You've got Otohime's dream of the surface, Fisher Tiger's trauma, centuries of discrimination, and a literal ancient arc hanging over everything. Of course you deliver the Joy Boy apology here. Of course you let these people believe the promise was about them. So when fans say, Fishman Island proves Oda had the Joy Boy promise planned as a Fishman liberation thing, I need you to slow down. The true foreshadowing payoff is Poseidon, the Sea Kings, the timing of Shirahoshi. The retrofit is the way that global promise gets localized into our island's destiny. Fishman Island is where a world-scale pre-written vow gets shrunk, misread, and clung to for 800 years. The real question is, if the Fishmen only caught the echo of that promise, Who was Joy Boy actually talking to? And in the next section, we need to follow the wording, the Noah's design, and the Sea King's whispers to a much more dangerous answer. Tracing Poseidon, from Skypiea hints to Shirahoshi's awakening. And to answer that, we need to zoom out from Fishman Island's trauma and trace the thing that actually sits at the center of Joy Boy's promise, Poseidon. Because listen to me, the way the community talks about Poseidon, you'd think Oda woke up during Fishman Island and went, "Oh, mermaid princess, Sea King's racism allegory, sure, that's thematic." But if you roll the tape back, the scaffolding for this weapon is sitting there way before Shirahoshi ever cries on panel. Go back to Alabasta. That's where ancient weapons first enter the story, and notice how they're framed. Crocodile and Robin don't say, "These are tools to liberate one oppressed race." They're introduced as world-shaking forces, powers that can destroy islands, reshape seas, overturn governments. The category is global. The scope is systemic. There is zero sense that any of this is racially earmarked. It's not Pluton, savior of the fishmen. It's Pluton, nightmare of the entire planet. That matters because it tells you what the author was planning. Ancient weapons were always a world-scale axis in the writing, not a bespoke Fishman Island solution Oda bolted on later. The promise is built around that scale. Then we hit Skypiea, and Oda starts quietly loading the gun. You get the voice of all things with Roger's crew and the poneglyphs. You get weird, borderline mystical entities hinted at in the background. And hanging over all of this, in the wider story, are these colossal sea kings we've already seen dragging ships around and eating pirates for breakfast, treated as forces of nature rather than characters. At the time, it just reads as fun world building. Big ocean monsters, cool. This is fine. Except here's the thing. Those threads intersect perfectly with what Poseidon turns out to be. We eventually learn that one ancient weapon isn't a battleship or a cannon. It's a person. Not just any person, but a mermaid princess who can command sea kings through a special voice that other chosen weirdos can hear. First, the story only calls Poseidon a weapon. Then it clarifies, no, it's a living being. Then, even later, it pins that role onto a specific character, Shirahoshi. That is a slow, methodical unmasking. It feels less like Oda improvising and more like he'd already written one weapon equals Sea King controller tied to the voice of all things in his outline and was just revealing that decision out of order. The gun on the mantelpiece here isn't a Fishman Island prophecy. It's the existence of the Sea Kings, the ancient weapons category, and the mystical voice, all seeded long before we ever see Ryugu Palace. So when Joy Boy apologizes to Poseidon, the weight of that apology is built on this pre-written, world-scale potential. The promise is structured around moving oceans, guiding Noah, altering the balance of the entire sea. Fishman emancipation is a consequence you can plug into that power, but it was almost certainly not the original Line 1 contract in Oda's notebook. And once you accept that, you have to ask a much nastier question. If the weapon came first and Fishman Island's reading came later, what else about that legend have they completely misread? The ancient kingdom's agenda versus Fishman Island's dream. So if the weapon came first and their reading came later, then we need to zoom the camera way out. Fishman Island is treating Joy Boy like a personal savior, but the breadcrumbs Oda actually gives you? They scream global agenda, not one kingdom customer service hotline. Here's the thing. Every hard clue about the ancient kingdom points to a plan that makes the current world order non-functional, not tweaked, not reformed, dismantled. You have a civilization that understood the ancient weapons, carved forbidden history into indestructible stone, and then got erased by 20 kingdoms who immediately built a sky palace and a global caste system on top of the crime scene. That is not the footprint of a group whose end goal was better HR policies for fishmen. That's a group trying to unify races, free the seas, and blow up the celestial dragon hierarchy at the root. Look at what those weapons actually do. Poseidon is command over sea kings, the literal infrastructure of ocean travel. Uranus is implied sky control. Pluton is continental level artillery. This is intentional. This is planned. You don't build that toolkit unless your mission statement is erase the monopoly the 20 kingdoms have over land, sea, and sky, and let every race move and live without permission. In that world, fishmen and merfolk aren't a side quest. They're ocean native allies whose freedom is baked into the revolution. So yes, Fishman liberation is on that agenda. Of course it is. But it's part of a coalition. Poseidon isn't Fishman Island's personal Uber. She's a planetary logistics weapon. The Sea Kings literally talk about waiting for their queen and a certain person to guide a ship that will matter for the whole world. That phrasing is your foreshadowing. The author is telling you the scale. Now contrast that with Otohime and Neptune. Their dream is so much smaller, and I don't mean that dismissively. It's heartbreakingly human. Otohime wants signatures on a petition, a seat at the reverie, a promise that her kids won't get shot on sight at Sabaody. Neptune wants Noah not to fall and crush his people. Their horizon is get accepted on the surface, end discrimination, secure safety for the next generation. That's it. That's the category of problem they're solving. I need you to notice the difference. The ancient kingdom is playing regime change. Otohime is playing civil rights. One is burn down Mary Geoise. The other is please invite us to the meeting. This is not a sin. This is normal. Oppressed groups reach for whatever story they have and resize it to fit immediate survival. So Fishman Island's dream ends up as a subset of that older revolution. Over 800 years, a global liberation project collapses into a fairy tale. Joy Boy was supposed to save us, and he failed. The apology to Poseidon becomes, he let Fishmen down. The Noah becomes our evacuation ship. The weapon becomes our ticket upstairs. Pattern interrupt. What if Joy Boy never promised them any of that? What if the real promise was to the world, and Fishman Island only ever heard the echo? Because if that's true, then Luffy inheriting Joy Boy's will doesn't just mean he'll honor Neptune's wish. It means he's obligated to finish a war that Otohime never even knew existed. And that, in turn, forces an ugly follow-up. What happens when Fishman Island's local myth collides with the actual terms of that ancient global contract? Every Joy Boy failed the Fishman panel, reread. So we need to do something very unsexy right now. We need to go back to panels you've seen 100 times in Twitter threads and actually read what they say, not what the community has decided they say. Start with the big one, Neptune in front of the poneglyph. The fandom summary is, Joy Boy promised to move Fishman Island and failed. That's the meme. That's the TikTok slideshow. But the stone itself, it's an apology addressed to Poseidon. Not to the Fishmen, not to Fishman Island LLC, to Poseidon. The author is handing you a category. This is a private letter between an ancient weapon and an ally who blew a mission. Here's the thing. Neptune is the one who connects that apology to his people's dream of the surface. He's the one who says, in effect, our ancestors were waiting for that day. That's not the stone talking. That's a king who has lived under a literal ceiling his whole life, projecting his national trauma onto an 800-year-old DM. This is not a sin. This is how humans and fishmen do storytelling. You get one scrap of history, you weld your pain onto it, and suddenly it's a promise. Next example, the recurring line that Joy Boy failed Fishman Island. You see it in how Otohime talks about signatures, in how the citizens mutter about impossible dreams, in how the Noah is framed as this broken, useless ark. But notice who is actually saying failed. It's never an omniscient narrator box. It's always people on the bottom of the ocean, staring at a rusting, immovable ship and concluding very reasonably, the plan for us didn't work. Listen to me. The plan that would have helped us failed is not the same category as he broke a contract with us. One is about outcome, the other is about obligation. Joy Boy not completing a planned operation that involved Poseidon, Sea Kings, and the Noah doesn't automatically mean he signed a Fishman-specific treaty and ghosted. fans have quietly slid from one meaning into the other because it feels cleaner. Cleaner exposition, cleaner grievance, cleaner payoff for Luffy. And Oda knows you do this. He weaponizes it. Wano. The Scabbards worship their savior prophecy, and then the story reveals they misunderstood the timing, the agent, and even the scale. Ohara? The government's version of history is treated as gospel until the Void Sentry leaks out and flips the entire frame. The pattern is intentional. Characters are confident, passionate, and wrong about history, so the later reveal can hit harder. So when you see those Fishman Island panels now, I need you to read them as tragic misreadings, not clean lore dumps. They're powerful because the people in them are clinging to an echo of a bigger war and assuming they were the main target. This is normal. This is exactly what any oppressed group would do if they found an ancient apology under their house. The uncomfortable question is, if Joy Boy's original promise wasn't actually centered on them, what happens when the real beneficiaries of that contract finally step on stage? What if Joy Boy's promise was never racially targeted? So let's actually poke the sacred cow here. What if Joy Boy's promise was never racially targeted in the first place, and the Fishmen have been centering themselves in someone else's contract for 800 years? I need you to sit with the literal text for a second. The poneglyph on Fishman Island does not say, "Dear Fishman, sorry I couldn't personally Uber you to the surface." It is an apology addressed to Poseidon for failing to fulfill a promise. That's it. That's the sentence. Everything about our people, our dream, our migration, is Neptune and Otohime projecting their current nightmare onto an ancient voicemail. And here's the thing. When an author is this obsessive about wording, you can't just hand-wave that away. Oda could have written, Joy Boy promised the Fishmen he'd bring them to the surface. He did not. He wrote an apology to a weapon whose job is to command Sea Kings and move a continent-sized ship. That's not a relocation plan for one marginalized neighborhood. That's infrastructure for a global renovation. Think about what a world-spanning promise would actually look like in this story. If Joy Boy's goal was to reshape the seas, topple the celestial dragons, or revive the ancient kingdom's legacy, that inherently hits every race at once. Raise the seafloor? Suddenly, Fishman Island isn't a death tunnel, it's prime real estate. Destroy Mary Geoise's red line choke point. The Tenryubito lose their literal throne. Free the Sea Kings to move Noah and whatever else is attached to that plan. You are not doing targeted charity, you are rewriting the operating system. Fishmen are the ones we sit with the longest in that oppression. Slavery and Sabaody, branding, discrimination, Fisher Tiger's trauma, Otohime's assassination. Of course they emotionally foreground the story. Of course every legend gets reinterpreted through, will this finally fix our hell? This is normal. This is exactly what any community would do when they find a myth that might finally explain why the universe hates them. But emotional foregrounding is not the same category as being the exclusive addressee of the promise. The problem is that fans keep collapsing those two. We see the Fishman's pain, we see the apology, and our pattern-seeking monkey brain that sees Jesus in toast goes, therefore Joy Boy's master plan was Fishman's civil rights arc. No. Joy Boy's plan is an anti-world government nuke. Fishman liberation is a consequence, not the sole objective. Oda has been screaming this at us in other arcs. Ohara gets erased. Dressrosa gets puppeted. Entire nations are chewed up by the celestial dragon's whims. Slaves in Mary Geoise aren't just fishmen, they're everyone. The cruelty is systemic, and the storytelling keeps widening the frame until you can't pretend this is one race's niche tragedy anymore. So when you put the poneglyph, Noah, Poseidon, and the Sea Kings waiting for that person foreshadowing together, the more coherent reading is that Joy Boy's promise was to dismantle the system that produced Fishman oppression, not to personally escort one species to a better zip code, which then raises a different, much scarier question. If the promise was global, who else has been quietly waiting for it to come due? Pattern-seeking monkeys. How we see Fishmen foreshadowing everywhere. And here's where that "who else is waiting" question turns the camera back on us. Because before we talk about Joy Boy's real target, we need to talk about your brain. My brain. Every brain watching this. We are pattern-seeking monkeys. We are the species that can see a vague blob in the sky and go, "Ah yes, clearly that is Sanji's left eyebrow in Gear 7. This is not a moral failing. This is not a sin. This is how you survived long enough to binge 1,000 chapters of pirate manga. You're wired to connect dots. A rustle in the grass? Might be wind, might be tiger. Your brain overreacts on purpose. In storytelling, that same survival hardware turns into something else. We start hallucinating foreshadowing. And in the One Piece community, when it comes to Fishman Island, that survival hardware is on performance-enhancing drugs. I need you to think about how many posts you've seen where someone screenshots a random underwater panel from East Blue and goes, "See? Proof Oda planned Fishman Island from Chapter 1. There's a fish in the logo? Fishman foreshadowing. Arlong has a saw shark nose? Clearly a deliberate visual echo of the Noah's prow. A sea cow shows up. Obviously a subtle allusion to sea kings waiting for Poseidon. Listen to me. Sometimes a fish is just a fish. Sometimes water in a seafaring adventure story is just water. The presence of an ocean motif in a pirate manga is not, by default, evidence of a 20-year Fishman relocation master plan. That doesn't mean Oda isn't insanely planned. It means we need to separate. The author is meticulous. From every blue pixel is secretly about Fishmen. Here's the thing. Once you've decided Joy Boy's promise is specifically, "I will move Fishman Island to the surface," your brain starts running a filter on the entire series. Every ambiguous line about the promised time? That's Fishman. Every shot of the sun? Fishman. Any mention of the surface world, discrimination, or the sea itself? Fishman, Fishman, Fishman. You're not reading, you're confirming. That's confirmation bias. You form the conclusion first, then only notice the data that flatters it. It's the same mental move as seeing religious imagery in random clouds or Jesus in toast. The toast did not attend divinity school. The toast is not making a theological argument. The profundity is in your pattern-hungry brain, not in the bread. Pattern interrupt. What if I told you this exact bias is why the Joy Boy promised the Fishman narrative feels so undeniable, even though the manga never actually says that sentence? Go back to the poneglyph. It's an apology to Poseidon for failing a promise. Neptune and Otohime, living in a bubble of Fishman suffering, interpret that through their pain. Of course they center their people. This is normal. But then fans take that localized myth and retroactively paste it over every wave Oda has ever drawn. And once that happens, the myth becomes self-reinforcing. The more you find Fishman-coded foreshadowing everywhere, the more confident you get that Joy Boy's promise must have been to them, which then makes you see even more evidence. It feels airtight. It feels planned. But it might just be Jesus in toast wearing a straw hat. So if our brains are this eager to overread Fishman intent into broad ocean world building, what happens when we finally force ourselves to read those same panels without the Fishman filter on? Oda's real flexibility, not omniscience. So when you strip off the Fishman-colored glasses and just read what's on the page, you run into a different problem. The story still works. The emotions still land. Joy Boy is still haunting the narrative. Which means we need to talk about Oda, not as a 4D chess god who planned every panel in 1997, but as a terrifyingly good improv jazz musician with a notebook. Here's the thing. We have receipts that he changes his mind. All the time. Thriller Bark was supposed to be shorter. Marineford ballooned because he kept adding characters and moments. Jinbei wasn't originally planned as a straw hat in the East Blue notes. That decision solidified way later. The Wano flashback got compressed because the series was running long. Ace was introduced as a gag younger brother, and then retrofitted into the emotional core of Marineford. This is not a sin. This is normal serialized writing. So how do you square that with the insane consistency around Joy Boy, Poseidon, the Void Sentry? You don't say, "Oh, never mind, it was all coincidence." You say, the endgame pieces were pre-written, the exact placements were flexible. The author has a box of ancient weapon puzzle parts, and he keeps deciding which table to assemble them on. Fishman Island is a perfect example. We know Poseidon is a pre-written concept. Oda has said the ancient weapons and the final war were in his original documents. But did he always intend the weapon's current incarnation to be a crying goldfish princess under 10,000 meters of water? Or did he arrive at Fishman Island, see this arc about racism, migration, and the surface and go, "Oh, that's where I plugged the Poseidon piece in"? Retrofits, but with pre-planned parts. Listen to me, that's harder than just following a 25-year script. Any robot can execute a fixed outline. It takes craft to walk into an arc. Notice that its themes rhyme with your ancient promise plot, and then thread Joy Boy's apology to Poseidon through Otohime's dream, and Fisher Tiger's trauma so cleanly that fans swear it had to be ordained from chapter 1. When the community treats every payoff as if it was nailed down on day one, we actually underestimate the skill involved in making those retrofits feel invisible. We erase the difference between "I always knew Joy Boy would be tied to Poseidon" and "I realized Fishman Island was the best stage to reveal that connection." Those are not the same category of planning, and pretending they are turns real craftsmanship into fake prophecy. I need you to see that the Joy Boy/Fishman connection hits so hard precisely because Oda found a way to align a global promise with a local struggle after the fact. The promise was about the world's shape. Fishman Island made it personal. That isn't Oda planned less. That's Oda planning differently, and honestly, more impressively, than the fandom myth allows. And once you accept that he's flexing puzzle pieces, not reading from stone tablets, a much scarier question opens up. If Fishman Island wasn't the original center of that promise, who was? Case study: Wano's prophecy and how we misread it too. And to answer that, we need to go to the other place the community temporarily decided was Joy Boy Central: Wano. Listen to me, Wano is the perfect cautionary tale for how we misread localized prophecy. You've got a country sealed off for centuries, borders literally weaponized as a defensive policy. You've got Toki, a woman from the Void Century, dropping this very clean, very fandom-friendly line. 20 years from now, a group of powerful individuals will arrive to defeat Kaido and open Wano's borders. Instant prophecy category. Instant Joy Boy will show up here discourse. On paper, it sounds tailor-made for a chosen one narrative. Closed country, time travel mum, samurai waiting for a messiah. The scabbards are holding on to this promise as their emotional oxygen, and every panel screams, this is where the real story comes home. And yet, when the dust settles, what does open the country actually mean? Not Wano is the final stage of Joy Boy's journey. It means stop being a bunker so the real war can start. Here's the thing. Wano is doing exactly what Fishman Island does. It treats a fragment of Void Century history as if it were Wano's personal destiny. Odin's journal, Toki's words, the Kazuki clan engraving poneglyphs. These are world-level jobs. The stakes are the ancient weapons, the One Piece, the fate of the seas. But the people living there experience all of that as our land, our prophecy, our savior. This is not a sin. This is normal. That is how human brains process apocalyptic lore. How does this fix my backyard? And fans fell for it again. We over-focused on Wano as the center of Joy Boy's return the same way we over-focused on Fishman Island as the center of Joy Boy's failure. Remember the theories? Joy Boy will be born in Wano. The drums of liberation will only sound once Wano opens. We had entire PowerPoints turning every shamisen panel into a Joy Boy foreshadowing slideshow. I say we because I was there, pattern-seeking monkey seeing Jesus in every shamisen string. Then Oda zooms out. Luffy gets the Nika reveal, sure, but Wano is not crowned the holy land of Joy Boy. It's a staging ground, a necessary unlock. The borders open not to complete the story, but to let the real storm in. The prophecy was never about Wano's ego. It was about the world's timeline. I need you to see the parallel. In both cases, Oda uses a local myth. Our hero will come. Our promise was broken, to emotionally anchor a global plotline. The people of Wano and Fishman Island are clinging to the one shard of the void century they can understand. Then, once we're attached, he reveals the bigger machine those shards belong to. So if Wano's grand prophecy turned out to be one country's angle on a world event, what are the odds Fishman Island's Joy Boy story is the same thing? Another localized lens. Another emotional zoom in on a promise that was always aimed at the entire sea. Which means the real question isn't, why did Joy Boy fail Fishman Island? It's, what world-sized promise were they standing in front of when the wave hit? Line by line, the Sea Kings, the Noah, and the promised time. So if Fishman Island was standing in front of a world-sized promise when the wave hit, the next question is obvious. Whose tide were they actually feeling? To answer that, we need to go to the only people in the story who were there for the original plan. Or, more accurately, the only monsters the size of skyscrapers who still remember it. The Sea Kings. The living black box of the Void Century. Listen to me. When Oda lets the Sea Kings talk around the Noah incident, he basically hands you the mission statement. They don't say, "Ah yes, finally, the age of Fishman liberation." What they say is, the promised time has come, and they tie that line to two triggers. The birth of Poseidon and the arrival of that person. Not that mermaid. Not that Fishman hero. A generic, open-ended that person. That is not racial language. That is system language. They spell it out even harder. One Sea King notes that their queen, Poseidon, has finally been born in this era, and another immediately jumps to, "We've waited for so long, centuries, plural. You don't wait 800 years for one island's housing crisis to get resolved. You wait 800 years for a scheduled patch to reality itself." Here's the thing. Every time they reference the payoff, the scope explodes. They talk about the world changing, about an era that's about to begin. That's global vocabulary. That's author brain vocabulary. If Oda wanted to tell you this was a Fishman-specific contract, he knows how to say Fishman Island, merfolk, our people. He's done it 1,000 times. The absence here is the foreshadowing. And the Noah? The Sea Kings explicitly say it's their job to pull it. This isn't a Fishman naval project. This is a Sea King tug service baked into the ocean's OS. Their whole perspective screams that they serve the sea itself. They're not Neptune's personal Uber fleet. They're a planetary infrastructure that just happens to be temporarily parked under his castle. Pattern interrupt. Notice who they never mention. Otoheim. Fisher Tiger. The discrimination. All the stuff the community emotionally centers when we talk about Joy Boy's promise. The Sea Kings do not care. Not because the suffering doesn't matter, but because their assignment predates those politics. Their writing is older than that discourse. I need you to clock the category difference here. Fishman Island talks about a dream. The Sea Kings talk about a schedule. One is a local mythos trying to retrofit itself into a prophecy. The other is an 800-year-old to-do list waiting for 2 login credentials, Poseidon and that person. And yes, we, as pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast panels, want to cram that into, Joy Boy will save the Fishman. This is normal. This is fine. But when the beings directly wired to Poseidon and the Noah only ever speak in world and era terms, we need to be very careful about shrinking their mission down to one persecuted race's narrative. If the ocean itself is running an update, then Joy Boy's promise was never a patch note for Fishman Island. It was the changelog for the entire map, and someone else is holding the other key. If Joy Boy didn't promise the Fishman, why make Fishman Island so central? So if the changelog is for the entire map, why does the patch notes screen always open on Fishman Island? Why is every Joy Boy discourse thread in the community basically a Fishman Island screenshot dump? Listen to me, that's not an accident. Oda absolutely hardwires Joy Boy into Fishman Island on purpose. The poneglyph is there, the Noah is parked there, Shirahoshi's Poseidon is born there. If you're an in-world historian, Fishman Island is the crime scene photo taped to the murder board with red string everywhere. That's intentional placement, not random set dressing. But here's the thing. Being the crime scene is not the same category as being the only victim. Fishman Island is the perfect narrative crucible, because every relevant ingredient is concentrated in one claustrophobic bubble. You've got an ancient weapon reincarnated as a sheltered princess. You've got the giant ark that only the Sea Kings can move. And you've got discrimination turned up to 11. From Otoheime's petitions to Fisher Tiger's trauma. If you're an author trying to make an 800-year-old broken promise emotionally legible, where else do you stage it? I need you to notice how efficient this is from a writing perspective. The Sea Kings talk in planetary terms, but the people suffering in front of us are the fishmen and merfolk. So the reader's brain, being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast and foreshadowing in every panel, fuses those together. Joy Boy failed. Fishman Island suffers. Therefore, Joy Boy failed, Fishman Island. It feels airtight because the emotional through line is so strong. This is not a sin. This is not bad storytelling. This is in fact how most long-form narratives keep you grounded. You anchor a massive, abstract promise to one community, one kingdom, one family that can carry the emotional weight. The Straw Hats aren't the only people affected by the world government, but they're the ones we watch get punched in the face, so our brain tags the government as the people who hurt Luffy's friends. Same structure here. Neptune reads an apology to Poseidon and his people and localizes it. This must be about our dream to reach the surface safely. Otoheime and Tiger filter that even further through racism and slavery. Generations stack interpretations until apology to Poseidon quietly mutates into contract with Fishman Island. This is normal. Communities reinterpret old texts through current pain. The problem is when fans forget that's what's happening and treat the localized myth as the original design doc. So when I say Joy Boy's promise wasn't Fishman specific, I'm not erasing Fishman Island. I'm saying they're the emotional face of a world-scale bug report. They are the most visible symptom, not the only intended patient. And Oda, being a very planned author, is absolutely exploiting that gap. Because once you've spent hundreds of chapters convinced this promise is about one persecuted race, what happens to your brain when the story calmly tells you the scope was always bigger than that? Joy Boy's real audience, Poseidon the sea and the future generation. So here's the thing I need you to actually sit with, because this is where the community reading of this promise really starts to wobble. When Neptune translates that poneglyph, he doesn't say, Joy Boy, sworn defender of Fishman Island, regrets missing your moving date. He says the contents are an apology to Poseidon. Explicitly. The addressed party is the ancient weapon, the mermaid who commands Sea Kings, and by extension those giant sea god Uber drivers who keep talking about our queen and that person they're waiting for. The stone is not tagged to Fishman Island HR, it's stamped to Poseidon and the forces of the sea. That's a different category of promise. Once you accept that, the framing shifts. Joy Boy isn't some freelance ally doing pro bono activism for one oppressed group. He's speaking as the representative of something bigger, the ancient kingdom, or at minimum, a coalition that wanted to rewrite how the whole world's power was structured. The Noah is not a neighborhood moving van. It's a continent-scale asset designed to be hauled by Sea Kings under Poseidon's command. That's infrastructure. That's planned policy. That's an author telling you, very intentionally, this was a global project that happened to route through Fishman Island. And because this is one piece, that project doesn't die when Joy Boy screws up. It mutates into a relay race. The Sea Kings literally spell it out. They're waiting for their queen and the other one to be born in the same era. Roger hears the voice of all things, sees the script, and laughs because he's too early. Luffy, walking Nika foreshadowing billboard that he is, shows up with the same hat, the same fruit, the same ridiculous impulse to free people as a hobby. The promise stops being a one-off contract and becomes a multi-era pipeline of inherited will. Roger hands it off. Luffy picks it up. You're not watching a single deal. You're watching scheduled maintenance on reality. Now, does Fishman Island matter in that? Obviously. They're a primary stakeholder. Their dream of reaching the surface dovetails perfectly with a sea and sky that are about to be reconfigured. When the red line falls, or the currents change, or whatever Oda has pre-written in that terrifying notebook, they stand to benefit massively. But they are not the sole client. They are one impacted group in a world patch that touches humans, sky people, Lunarians, the whole ecosystem. Treating Joy Boy's promise as a private Fishman Island contract is the same problem we have with foreshadowing posts that crop a panel and ignore the page. So when Joy Boy fails, what actually fails? Not just a relocation plan. The entire world. The ancient kingdom's agenda stalls. The sea doesn't get its new operating system. Fishman Island suffers, yes, but as part of a planet-wide missed update, not as the only customer left on red. And once you see it that way, you have to ask, if the promise was always global, what exactly is Luffy supposed to flip when he finally cashes it in? So, what did Fishman Island actually get wrong? So here's where Fishman Island actually fumbles the ball. Not morally, not thematically, historically. They're working off a bad summary of an 800-year-old group project. Their belief is simple and very understandable. Joy Boy promised to bring them to the surface. Full stop. In their heads, the Noah is basically a celestial moving truck. Joy Boy was the guy who booked the elevator. And the promise was, one day, I will personally escort you to a world where you can live freely above. That's the bedtime story. That's what Otohime is preaching, what Neptune is quietly hoping for, what the whole community is emotionally orbiting. Except, that's not what the text actually says. Neptune explicitly calls that poneglyph an apology to Poseidon. The ship is moved by Sea Kings under Poseidon's command. The Sea Kings themselves talk about waiting for their queen and that person to meet. So when you reconstruct it, Joy Boy's promise isn't, I'll save Fishman Island. It's, I'll execute this planned world-scale operation with Poseidon. The Fishmen being freed is a consequence of the patch, not the patch notes. Here's the thing. Their core emotional read is not wrong. They are correct that their fate is chained to an ancient promise. They are correct that a future savior figure is baked into that contract. They're just assuming they were the customer when historically they were one line item on a cosmic work order. This is not a sin. This is how every oppressed group interprets myth. You grab the one part of the legend that sounds remotely tailored to your suffering and you hold it like a lifeline. But that's where the timeline problem creeps in. Fishman Island is waiting for Joy Boy. Singular. One guy, one era, one fix. They frame it as a missed appointment. He didn't show 800 years ago, so they've been stuck in the lobby ever since, staring at the elevator doors. What that completely ignores is the relay race structure Oda has been foreshadowing everywhere. Ancient Kingdom to Joy Boy to Roger, Roger to Luffy. The will is intentional. The handoff is planned. The point is that Joy Boy was never supposed to be the final runner. Pattern interrupt. What if Joy Boy did exactly what he was supposed to do, and the rest of the world is just late catching up? Suddenly the failure on that poneglyph reads less as, I broke my promise to you, Fishman, and more as, the operation stalled. Someone in the future will have to resume it. And that misalignment is precisely where Luffy walks in. He isn't there to finally keep a narrow Fishman-specific promise. He's there to complete Joy Boy's broader global update. In doing that, he doesn't invalidate Fishman Island's dream. He finally puts it in the correct category. Not a private miracle, but one piece of a world that's been waiting centuries for someone to hit resume. Which raises the real question we need to ask. What does Luffy actually have to change about the world structure for that resume button to do anything at all? Reclassifying the evidence, foreshadowing, retrofitting, or pre-writing. So if we're talking about the resume button, we need to figure out what's actually on the desktop and what's just a bunch of fan-made shortcuts. That means we stop vibes reading and we start sorting. I need you to put on the lab coat with me for a second. Here's the thing. Not every Joy Boy clue is the same category of writing. Some of it is pre-writing, some of it is genuine foreshadowing, and some of it is in-universe retrofitting, where characters are doing exactly what the community does on Twitter threads at 3 a.m. Take the Fishman poneglyph. On paper, it's simple. Joy Boy's apology addressed to Poseidon. That to Poseidon tag is crucial. That's not to the Fishman, that's not to Otaheim's future political platform. That is a direct line to an ancient weapon concept Oda clearly had planned long before Fishman Island as an arc. The wording is vague about the actual promise, which is perfect pre-writing. Lock in the relationship, leave the execution flexible. Poseidon itself, that's pre-writing too. An ancient weapon that controls sea kings, tied to the Void Century, named and slotted alongside Pluton and Uranus. That's not something you improvise in the shower between chapters. The fact that it reincarnates as a mermaid princess is the payoff. The weapon framework, the queen of the Sea Kings, that's the blueprint. Now watch what happens when that blueprint passes through Neptune. His explanations to Robin and the crew are drenched in Fishman Island's trauma. He reads Joy Boy's apology and immediately frames it as our failed salvation, our promised migration. That's retrofitting, but in-universe. The author isn't scrambling, the character is. He's taking a global Poseidon promise and reskinning it as a Fishman-specific contract, because that's the story his people need. The Noah sits right on the border. Its design, its size, the fact that Sea Kings are explicitly meant to tow it. Pre-writing tied to Poseidon and some massive population movement. But the idea that its only purpose is to haul fishmen to the surface is again Neptune's inference. The ship doesn't come with an instruction manual that says fishmen only. That's a local myth stapled onto a global asset. Meanwhile, the Sea King's lines are where we finally get clean foreshadowing. They talk about waiting for their queen and a certain person. They recognize Shirahoshi as Poseidon. They react to Luffy's presence. Those moments were written to pay off in Fishman Island specifically. Early hints in Skypiea and elsewhere about mysterious voices and calling creatures. That's foreshadowing for the Mermaid Princess reveal and the Sea King's role. Otohime's dream is pure retrofitting in emotional form. She takes the ancient Poseidon/Noah infrastructure and welds it to her political goal. Coexistence on the surface. This is not a sin. This is normal. People project. Characters project. Our pattern-seeking monkey brains see a giant arc and go, ah yes, that's my civil rights legislation. Once you categorize it all, a pattern snaps into focus. The pre-written layer is global. Ancient weapons, Sea Kings, a promise to Poseidon about moving something huge. The retrofits are local. Fishman's suffering, Otaheim's activism, Neptune's hopeful readings. The foreshadowing stitches the two together, just enough to keep you convinced they're the same thing. So if Joy Boy's promise was always world scale and Fishman Island only caught the echo, the real question isn't who did he fail anymore. It's way worse. What was he actually trying to move, and who stands in the way of moving it this time? Why over-crediting planning hurts our read of One Piece. And this is where the fandom brain rot really kicks in. Because instead of sitting with that way worse question, a huge chunk of the community sprints back to the safest headcanon. Don't worry, Oda planned a super specific Fishman Island promise in 1997, and we just haven't seen the full PowerPoint yet. And listen to me, that instinct is comforting. It's also exactly how we miss what he's actually doing. When you insist on 25 years of flawless 4D chess, you stop looking at the actual artistry on the page. You stop noticing how the author is adapting, recontextualizing, deepening earlier material in response to new ideas and new emotional priorities. Everything becomes proof of an ancient spreadsheet. Joy Boy's vague apology? Obviously ironclad Fishman relocation contract. Neptune's hopeful interpretation? Obviously objective exposition. The problem isn't that this overcredits planning. The The problem is that it undercredits writing. Here's the thing. Oda's real magic trick isn't omniscient pre-planning, it's controlled retrofitting. He lays down a loose, intentional scaffold. Joy Boy, ancient weapons, a broken promise, and then, years later, threads characters through it who will misunderstand that scaffold in really human ways. Otohime reads the legend through pacifism. Fisher Tiger reads it through rage. Neptune reads it through fatherly desperation. None of them have the full script. They're doing what you and I do, grabbing an old myth and bending it around their pain. But if you're in Oda planned everything mode, you don't allow that. You treat every in-universe belief as a lore dump. You flatten character perspective into narrator voice. That's exactly how Joy Boy apologized to Poseidon quietly mutates into Joy Boy promised the Fishmen personally and canonically. We need to admit that a huge amount of so-called foreshadowing discourse is just us refusing to categorize dialogue as fallible. And that refusal has a cost. It strips arcs of their emotional nuance. Fishman Island is literally about people misunderstanding history, clinging to myths, and weaponizing half-remembered promises to justify either submission or violence. The Noah, the Sea Kings, the Poneglyph, those are concrete artifacts, the meaning stapled onto them by generations of oppressed people. That's fragile, contingent, sometimes wrong. When we overwrite that with no, Oda's just drip-feeding the wiki, we erase the tragedy. This is not a sin. This is normal. Authors retrofit. Authors discover better uses for old toys. Recognizing that doesn't cheapen One Piece. It highlights how absurdly good Oda is at weaving evolving ideas into a cohesive whole so it feels planned, even when the details clearly shifted. The community treating retrofit as a dirty word is us being pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast and then get mad when someone says, "That's just bread, dude." So when we talk about Joy Boy's promise, I need you to let go of the fantasy that there was a Fishman-specific contract etched in stone on Oda's desk in 1997. The broad shape, pre-written, the exact way Fishman Island misreads and inherits it. That's the adaptive genius. And once you accept that, a much weirder, more interesting question opens up. If the Fishmen were never the original addressee, who was actually on the other end of that apology? Because the text has been quietly pointing at that answer for years. A healthier way to talk about foreshadowing online. So if the text has been pointing at that answer for years, we need to fix the tool we're using to talk about it. Because half the reason Joy Boy's promise to the Fishmen became gospel is that the community mashed together three different things and stamped foreshadowing on the box. Here's the thing. I need you to reserve that word for when we actually have receipts. Foreshadowing should mean there's strong evidence the author intentionally planted a specific setup for a specific payoff. Not "this vaguely rhymes with a theme" or "this panel feels prophetic in hindsight." Concrete, targeted, planned. Laboon's crew and Brooks' backstory? That's foreshadowing. The Fishmen emotionally adopting Joy Boy's apology as their personal promise? That's a different category. And we need those other categories. When Oda goes back to an old element and gives it new, sharper meaning, that's a good retrofit. When he echoes earlier imagery or dialogue to reward long-term readers, that's a smart callback. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most long-running storytelling survives contact with reality. Calling every satisfying echo foreshadowing is like calling every tool in the drawer a screwdriver and then wondering why your shelves keep falling down. Take Joy Boy. Neptune reads the Poneglyph and says it's an apology to Poseidon. The wording never explicitly says, "I, Joy Boy, swear to liberate Fishman Island and only Fishman Island." That extra step is what the characters believe. That's their interpretation, built out of pain and hope and centuries of myth. The narrative, on the other hand, only confirms a failed promise tied to Poseidon, the Noah, and a future meeting. If we don't separate what the characters believe from what the story actually guarantees, we end up treating Otohim's dream as if it's a binding contract the universe has to honor. Pattern interrupt. Not everything a character says is a lore drop. Sometimes it's just a person being wrong on main for 800 years. Void Century topics are where this gets especially messy. Oda is intentionally redacting information. He is playing a long espionage game with his own backstory. So when we talk about Joy Boy, the ancient kingdom, or who the promise was really aimed at, we have to be transparent. Say, this is speculation, or this is my read based on XYZ panels, instead of quietly sliding headcanon into the canon pile and then using it as evidence for more headcanon. I do this too. I am also a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. This is not gatekeeping. This is media literacy. Tightening our categories doesn't make the series less magical. It lets us see the actual magic trick. When we can say, this part was pre-written, this part is foreshadowing, this part is a retrofit built on character misunderstanding, we stop worshipping Oda as a chaos god and start appreciating him as a terrifyingly competent craftsman. And once you're holding the right tools, you can finally ask the real question about Joy Boy's promise. If it was never primarily to the Fishmen, what was it actually designed to do? What this means for Luffy's final mission. If Joy Boy's promise was never a boutique Save the Fishmen quest, then Luffy's final mission cannot be either. It can't be escort the mermaids to the surface as a side objective. It has to be rewrite the operating system of the planet so that Fishman freedom is a natural consequence of the patch notes. Here's the thing. Once you accept that the apology poneglyph is addressed to Poseidon, not stamped to Fishman Island, from Joy Boy, sorry for the delay, the category changes. We're not in local civil rights arc territory. We're in global infrastructure overhaul. The Noah isn't a cruise ship. It's a piece of a pre-written world update, and Luffy's job is to finally hit install. So what does that actually mean in story? Beyond me sounding the way your high school English teacher feared manga analysis would go. It means the endgame task is to reshape the world itself, not symbolically, physically. Sea levels, borders, the red line, the calm belts, the whole map screen. If Poseidon's command over Sea Kings was originally meant to move the Noah, then we need to ask, move it where and for what operation? You don't build a continent-sized ark just to shuttle one island 30 meters upward. I need you to remember how often Oda has drawn the red line as a literal wound through the globe. Fishman Island is stapled under that wound, in the dark, under crushing pressure, dependent on a bubble and a world government toll road just to exist. That is not an accident. That's foreshadowing for a planned demolition job. You have ancient weapons that can control the sea, erase islands, and guide the world. You have a ship designed to be dragged by Sea Kings. You have a hero whose fruit was intentionally written as the embodiment of freedom. What do you think the author is steering you toward? The cleanest version is brutal in its simplicity. Destroy or reshape the red line, redistribute the seas, and in the process make the surface safe and reachable for everyone, fishmen included. Not because the universe bent over backwards to hand them a bespoke miracle, but because the entire unfair architecture got torn down. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is exactly how you pay off a centuries-old promise without turning it into a race-specific coupon code. And suddenly, Madame Shirley's vision of Luffy destroying Fishman Island stops reading as, oh no, targeted tragedy, and starts reading as, oh right, tectonic renovation. The island breaks, the bubble pops. But if the red line is gone or transformed, if the seas have calmed, then what looked like annihilation is just the scaffolding coming off. The community's worst fear becomes the transitional state of liberation. Which brings us to the emotional part, because Oda always hides the thesis in the feelings. Fishman Island becomes the barometer, the test strip you dip into the new world to see if Joy Boy's promise actually landed. Are fishmen walking under the sun without collars? Are merfolk children visiting any ocean they want without a celestial dragon stamp? If the answer is no, then Luffy hasn't finished the job, no matter how many flags he burns. Listen to me. That's why the story keeps tying Nika, Poseidon, and the Noah together. They're not props. They're the levers for a single, terrifyingly intentional world event. And the real question, the one Oda has been quietly pre-writing toward for 25 years, is who else gets pulled under when Luffy finally throws that switch? Revisiting the opening claim, did we prove Joy Boy didn't promise the Fishmen? So we need to zoom out for a second and actually audit what we've done here. Remember where the community started on this. The standard belief is brutally simple. Joy Boy made a specific promise to the Fishmen. He was supposed to bring them to the surface. He failed. Full stop. End of story. Open and shut tragedy. Stamp deadbeat ancient ally on his forehead and move on. Except, here's the thing. When you go back to the actual text, that certainty starts to melt. The Fishman Island poneglyph does not say, "To the proud people of Fishman Island, I, Joy Boy, swear to relocate you to the surface." It's an apology. It's addressed to Poseidon. Neptune literally spells this out. The focus of the tablet isn't a nation, it's a weapon. That's not just a wording nitpick, that's a category error in how the fandom has framed the entire promise. Then you stack the other pieces. Poseidon is a mermaid princess reincarnated every few centuries, not a hereditary Fishman Island job. The Sea Kings talk about waiting for their queen and a certain person, in a language only they and Shirahoshi share. The Noah is an absurdly huge ark, explicitly meant to be moved by those Sea Kings under Poseidon's command. This is not a neighborhood carpool. This is a global infrastructure project that just happens to be parked over Fishman Island's head. I need you to notice what that does to the scope. The foreshadowing trail we walk through, the poneglyph's Poseidon focus, the Sea King's world-spanning language, the scale of the Noah, the way Nika imagery keeps getting stapled to all of this, consistently points outward. Joy Boy's promise reads less, "I will personally fix Fishman's segregation," and more, "I will execute a planned world event where Poseidon is the keystone." Fishman Island sits at ground zero, but it's not the only intended beneficiary. Now, the strongest pushback here is honestly fair. Neptune says Joy Boy failed them. Otohime and Fisher Tiger frame the legend as their people's hope. Are you really telling me all of them are just wrong? And listen to me. I am not saying these characters are stupid. What I am saying is that they are doing what humans do, what this community does, what I do every time I turn into a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. They are reinterpreting a vague ancient apology through the lens of their own pain. This is not a sin. This is normal. Of course, a persecuted undersea kingdom hears, "I failed to keep my promise to Poseidon," and emotionally translates that as, "I failed you." In terms of storytelling, that's powerful. In terms of author-confirmed canon, it's still perspective, not a notarized contract. So where does that leave us? With a cleaner thesis. Joy Boy's promise was never to the Fishmen alone. It was to Poseidon and the world, with Fishman Island positioned as one of the biggest casualties of his failure, not the only client on the invoice. And once you accept that, the next question practically asks itself, if the original promise was global, who else, which races, which kingdoms were supposed to be on that ark when the world finally moved? Why this reframe makes Fishman Island more tragic, not less. And here's where I need you to slow down, because this is the part where a cool theory quietly turns Fishman Island into a horror story. If Joy Boy didn't just fail Fishman Island, but failed the entire world, then their centuries of discrimination and isolation aren't an isolated tragedy. They're one tile in an 800-year domino line of fallout from a global promise that never landed. That means the chains on Fishman Island are not bespoke, they're standard issue. The poneglyph apology to Poseidon, the Noah built to be hauled by Sea Kings, the Sea Kings talking about that day and that person, all of that points to a planned, intentional world-scale operation. Relocation, renewal, something. Joy Boy drops the ball on that, and suddenly every race, every kingdom that was supposed to be on that metaphorical arc is scrambling in the dark. Fishman Island just happens to be the one place we actually see the bruises. Now here's the thing, once you see that, their belief in a Fishman-specific promise stops being comforting and becomes devastating. They took a global hope and shrunk it down to fit their own trauma. This is not a sin, this is normal. When your community has been enslaved, hunted, shoved under the sea, of course you grab the legend and say, no, this one is ours. This promise was about us. It's pattern-seeking monkey brain, seeing Jesus in toast and going, he came to my breakfast. And the problem is, they're not entirely wrong. They do matter. They were on the blueprint. They've just zoomed in so far they can't see the rest of the map. That reframing makes Otohime and Fisher Tiger look way more heroic, not less. Because suddenly, they're not just arguing against local racism, they're pushing against the inertia of an 800-year systemic failure they don't even have the vocabulary to describe. Otohime begging for signatures is her trying to manually reboot a world plan she's never been briefed on. Fisher Tiger, freeing slaves without caring about race, is him accidentally realigning with the original global scope of Joy Boy's dream. They're working off a distorted fragment of the truth, and still, through sheer stubbornness, they manage to move history a few inches. Pattern interrupt. This is where most stories would say, well, tough luck, you misunderstood the prophecy. One Piece does the opposite, because when Luffy, as this Joy Boy / Nika inheritor, eventually fulfills that global promise, when Poseidon, the Noah, and the Sea Kings finally do what they were built to do, Fishman Island's misreading gets retroactively vindicated. Their faith was pointed at the wrong category, but the right direction. The author has planned it so that even their error is folded into the payoff. So the arc stops being a story about a race waiting for a memo that never arrives, and becomes a story about people clutching a broken, misprinted flyer for the future and still managing to hand it forward. And the real question we need to ask is, if Fishman Island only had a shard of the original promise, who else out there is living on the other pieces? From myth-busting to appreciation. How to reread One Piece now. So here's where this stops being a Joy Boy trivia correction and starts being homework for your brain. If Fishman Island has been clutching a misprinted flyer for 800 years, I need you to go back to those chapters and actually read who's speaking, not just what's being said. Reread Otohime's speeches, Neptune's exposition, the poneglyph scene. Ask yourself every time, is this the narrative talking? Or is this a desperate king projecting his people's pain onto an 800-year-old apology that never mentions Fishman once? The stone literally says Joy Boy is apologizing to Poseidon. That's a character perspective problem, not a lore retcon. And once you see that category difference, perspective versus fact, you can't unsee it. Then go to the laugh tale flashbacks, Roger hearing the story and just laughing his lungs out. We never get the full script. We get his reaction. We get Rayleigh's summary. We get Whitebeard's interpretation. You are not reading a history textbook. You are watching 4 old pirates give book reports on a play they barely understood. This is normal. This is how Oda keeps the endgame pre-written and still surprising. Same with Shirahoshi and the Sea Kings. The Noah isn't some bespoke moving truck for Fishman Island's lease agreement. It's a world-scale asset that only moves under Poseidon's command for a plan Joy Boy already set up with the ancient kingdom. The Fishmen made it their story because of course they did. When you're drowning, every floating door looks intentional. This is not a sin. This is how humans and fish humans cope. Now here's the thing. Once you have the foreshadowing / retrofitting / pre-writing model in your head, you can start speedrunning the rest of One Piece with it. Go stare at every Blackbeard scene and ask, which parts are clearly pre-written payoffs? The 3-skull flag, the strange bodyline, and which parts feel retrofit, where Oda went, oh, that's a fun angle, I'm stealing that. Do the same with Imu's shadowy introduction, or every ancient weapon info dump that very conspicuously dodges concrete numbers and dates. You stop worshipping this as an omniscient 4D chess plan and start appreciating it as a dance between a very planned spine and very chaotic muscles. The author isn't a prophet. He's a meticulous hoarder, sorting through 25 years of notes going, "Can I cash this in now?" And once you watch for where characters are confidently wrong about history, Gorosei, O'Hara, Walpole, whoever, you start seeing all the deliberate blind spots in the storytelling. Listen to me. The Joy Boy / Fishman reframing is not a one-off galaxy brain take. It's the tutorial level. It's the example that trains you to stop swallowing in-universe myths as gospel and start asking, who benefits from this version of the story? Because if Fishman Island only ever had the echo of a global promise, what happens when we apply that same scrutiny to the Will of Deep or to the story Emu is telling the entire world right now? Summing up, the 3 categories and one big misunderstanding. So we need to zoom out before our brains finish melting and we start seeing Joy Boy's face in every stone carving like a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. We've thrown a lot of terminology around. I want you walking out of this with a clean mental model, not a migraine. Here's the thing. We've been using 3 buckets this whole time: foreshadowing, retrofitting, and pre-writing. Foreshadowing is the classic version. The author intentionally plants a specific detail early because they already know the specific payoff. Gun on the mantle, bullet in Act 3, case closed. Retrofitting is when the author goes back to an old detail and assigns it new meaning later. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, how most long serials survive. And pre-writing is the big one. The author has the macro plan, the ending, the major reveals written in their head or their notes, and serialization is just them revealing pieces of that decision out of order. When you apply that framework to Joy Boy, Poseidon, and the Noah, the pattern is actually pretty calm. Most of it sits in pre-writing. The existence of an ancient apology to Poseidon, an ancient weapon that commands sea kings, and a giant ark those sea kings can drag. That smells planned at the blueprint level. The specific way Fishman Island turns that into our destined moving day to the surface is, in-universe, a retrofit. Neptune, Ottoheim, the priests, they take a fragment of a world-scale plan and reinterpret it through 800 years of racial trauma. Listen to me. The poneglyph itself is boringly clear. Neptune straight up says it's an apology to Poseidon for failing to keep a promise. That's it. It does not say, "Dear Fishman, sorry I ghosted your island relocation contract." The only thing canonically guaranteed is that Joy Boy failed Poseidon, who is a title, not a race, and he felt bad enough to carve that failure into indestructible stone. Everything else? That's Fishman Island doing what every oppressed community does in a long story. Grabbing the one scrap of hope in the archive and saying, "This must be about us. This is normal. This is fine." From a writing perspective, that's not Oda messing up. That's Oda weaponizing misunderstanding. He lets a global promise, something involving sea kings, the Noah, and a chosen person the sea kings keep whispering about, feel hyperlocal and personal to one underwater kingdom. And that's his real strength here. Oda's not just flexing pre-writing, he's braiding categories. The pre-written macro plan about Poseidon and the Noah gets filtered through in-universe retrofitting by Neptune and Ottoheim. And then he sprinkles actual foreshadowing on top with Luffy, Shirahoshi, and the Sea Kings to steer you toward the real scope. So here's your one-sentence takeaway. The thing I need you to tattoo on your brain for the rest of this video. Joy Boy's promise was never to the Fishmen alone. The Fishmen turned a world's broken dream into their own prophecy. And if one island can do that to Joy Boy, what do you think the entire world has been doing to the Will of D? Changing how we argue about One Piece without killing the fun. And that move, that tiny reframing of Joy Boy from Fishman Island's personal savior to global narrative football, is where I need you to zoom out from the lore and look at us. Not them. Us. Because the way Neptune misreads a stone tablet, That is the way this community misreads each other every single day on Twitter, Reddit, and whatever cursed Discord server you crawled out of. Arguing about foreshadowing, about what the author really planned, is fun. It's the sport. This is normal. The problem is when every disagreement turns into a canon war, where your headcanon is the one true reading and everyone else is an idiot who doesn't understand writing. Suddenly, we're not talking about a fictional pirate rubber man. We're prosecuting each other for thought crimes. So, here's the thing. Most of what we're doing is interpretation. It's reading tea leaves. It's me, a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, pointing at a panel from chapter 130 and going, "Ah yes, Clear Gear 5 foreshadowing." This is fine. This is not a sin. It only becomes a problem when you drop the "I think" and start talking in courtroom language. Oda clearly intended. Obviously the plan was, any real fan knows. We need to change the verbs. Instead of Oda meant, try my read is. Instead of this proves pre-planning, try this fits best as a retrofit. Those tiny phrases turn a punch in the face into an invitation. You're not declaring scripture. You're offering a theory. You're leaving space for the author to be human and for other fans to be smart in a different direction. And crucially, I need you to treat character beliefs as data points, not gospel. Neptune saying Joy Boy's promise to Fishman Island is not Oda stepping onto the stage with a microphone. It's a guy, in-universe, interpreting an apology to Poseidon through 8 centuries of racial trauma and royal family bedtime stories. Same with Clover on O'Hara, same with Doflamingo ranting about the celestial dragons, same with Morgans frothing over the story. These are clues. They are not the narrator. Pattern interrupt. The Void Century is not a group project where you get extra credit for guessing the teacher's outline from chapter 1. You are allowed to say, this might just be cool coincidence. You are allowed to say, this was probably not planned, but it retrofits beautifully into the endgame. That doesn't kill the magic. That's how you respect the craft. Myth-busting does not have to be joy-killing. When I say, Joy Boy's promise was never to the Fishmen, I'm not closing a door, I'm opening 10 more. Suddenly you can ask better questions about Poseidon, about the ancient kingdom, about who else misappropriated that promise. The story gets deeper, not thinner. So take this level of nuance and aim it at the rest of the minefield. Joy Boy's identity, Emu's plan, Blackbeard's fruit situation. You don't have to assume 4D chess every time Oda draws a shadowy silhouette. You can say, maybe this was pre-written, maybe this was a retrofit. Here's why I lean one way, and still have a blast arguing. Because now that we've cleaned up the way we argue, we can finally go back into the text and ask the real question. If Joy Boy's promise wasn't to the Fishmen, who was actually on the other end of that deal? Your turn. Rewrite the promise. And the discourse. So now we're here. We've ripped up the comfy headcanon pillow, we've vacuumed the feathers out of the carpet, and we're left with the annoying question, if Joy Boy's promise wasn't to the Fishmen, what was it? Here's the thing. I don't want to just feed you a new sentence for you to repeat in the comments section for the next 10 years. I need you to actually write it. If you had to boil it down into one line, based only on what the poneglyph actually says, on Neptune calling it an apology to Poseidon, on the Noah being moved by sea kings for some larger world plan, how would you phrase that promise? To aid Poseidon in guiding all peoples to the surface. To cooperate with the ancient kingdom's plan to reshape the seas. Put your version in the comments, word it as tightly as you can. Treat it as a draft you're handing to an editor, and while you're down there, use the framework. We need to train this muscle as a community. Pick a moment from Fishman Island or from any era of One Piece and tag it. Foreshadowing, retrofit, or pre-writing. Hodie's rant about human hatred. The Sea Kings talking about that day and that person. Shirahoshi's tears when she hears them. Which category are you putting each example in, and why? Don't just throw the word foreshadowing at the screen like you're seasoning fries. Tell me what you think Oda actually planned, what he reinterpreted, and what was locked in before Chapter 1. Also, do me a favor. The next time someone on Twitter, TikTok, or whatever cursed forum you frequent confidently types, "Joy Boy promised to save the Fishmen," with no panel, no quote, no poneglyph, just vibes, drop this video in there. Politely. Or at least semi-politely. Hey, here's a 2-hour breakdown from a deranged pattern-seeking monkey who read the actual text. If we're going to argue, we can at least argue from the page. Rewatch challenge time. I need you to go back to Fishman Island with this in your head. Myth on one side, text on the other. Watch Otohime's speeches knowing she might be clinging to the echo of someone else's promise. Watch Neptune read that stone and hear it as an apology to Poseidon, not a contract with his kingdom. Watch the Noah move and ask, is this about Fishman Island? Or is Fishman Island standing in front of a much older plan? See how different the arc feels when you separate what the characters believe from what the author actually wrote. And if you made it all the way through this, listen to me. Thank you. You just sat through a feature-length rant where I tried to fix one sentence in the fandom's brain. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is what happens when storytelling is good enough that we care whether the promise on an 800-year-old rock was worded correctly. So go argue in the comments. Go rewrite Joy Boy's promise. Go re-tag your favorite foreshadowing moments, and the next time someone tells you Oda just planned it all 20 years ago, you'll know the difference.